1970. The story as told by the Warrens begins not with a haunted doll or a tragic newspaper clipping, but with a Raggedy Ann doll purchased as a gift. Donna, a nursing student, received the doll from her mother as she was preparing to graduate college with her own nursing degree. She brought it to the apartment she shared with her roommate Angie, and almost immediately, strange things started to happen. They claimed the doll began appearing in different positions and different rooms despite being left elsewhere. This started as gradual, small movements and eventually led to something much bigger. Unsure of what to do next, Donna and Angie reached out to a medium. A seance was arranged. During the session, the medium claimed to make contact with a spirit who identified herself as Annabelle Higgins. According to the story relayed to them, Annabelle had once lived on the property before the apartment complex was built. Those, they were told, were her happy times. She was said to have been only 7 years old when her body was discovered in the field where the building now stood. And that's really all we know. But through the medium, the spirit expressed that she felt safe and comfortable with Donna and Angie and simply wanted to stay with them and be loved. Moved by the story and feeling sympathy for the child, Donna gave the spirit permission to inhabit the doll and remain in her home. It wouldn't take long for them to believe they had made a big mistake. Whatever was attached to the doll, they would later claim, was not the harmless spirit of a young girl. This was no ordinary doll, and this would become no ordinary case. Notes allegedly began appearing on parchment paper, a type of paper that neither woman kept in the apartment. The handwriting was described as childlike, reading short pleas such as "help us" and "help Lou." Lou just happened to be Angie's fiancé. He had been present since the doll first entered the apartment and never trusted it. He would repeatedly warn Donna that something just felt wrong and he urged her to get rid of it, but she refused. One night, Lou jolted awake in terror, caught in what felt like a waking paralysis. Something many experts attribute to sleep patterns, but others claim to be paranormal. Unable to move, he watched as the doll appeared at his feet, slowly gliding up his body until it reached his chest. He claimed it began to strangle him, leaving him gasping for air until he blacked out. When he woke the next day, he was convinced that it had not been a dream and needed to confront whatever he believed was attached to the doll. His final encounter came shortly after. While preparing for a trip, Lou and Angie heard strange rustling coming from Donna's bedroom. Fearing an intruder, Lou cautiously approached the room. Inside, nothing appeared disturbed except for the doll lying on the floor. As he stepped closer, he felt as though something was standing behind him. When he turned, no one was there. Moments later, he doubled over in pain, clutching his chest. According to him, in later retellings, 7 claw-like scratches appeared across his torso, all going in different directions and burning as if freshly inflicted. The marks faded quickly, half gone by the next day and completely healed within 2. For Lou, it was proof that whatever was connected to the doll was neither harmless nor human. It was then Donna had enough of the strange behavior in her small apartment and contacted the church, who escalated the matter the only way they knew how. They contacted Ed and Lorraine Warren. For context, Ed and Lorraine Warren were known in the paranormal world as investigators, authors, and demonologists. And they really were the start of ghost investigations and brought them into the limelight of pop culture. They founded the NESPR, New England Society for Psychic Research. This was New England's paranormal research headquarters in 1952, and they have their names tied to some of the most prolific and most haunted cases in history, and the most polarizing, might I add, most of which you have already heard one way or another. They investigated what we know as the Perrin family haunting, the Enfield poltergeist, Amityville horror, Stepney Cemetery, the Smurl House, and the case of Arnie Cheyenne Johnson, where demonic possession came into play in the courtroom in a ballsy move, but was ultimately dismissed as factual evidence. Lorraine was a medium who claimed to be clairvoyant, and Ed was a self-taught, self-proclaimed demonologist. Together, they worked side by side on these cases and left their mark in the paranormal world, for better or for worse. Ed and Lorraine quickly became involved after hearing about the doll and the strange activity in Donna's apartment. Much like with the other cases I mentioned earlier, in several instances, they placed themselves at the center of the investigation, at times edging out other researchers just for cases that would later draw worldwide attention. Maybe it was their name, maybe it was the notoriety, or maybe these cases really had something special going on. After speaking with Donna, Angie, and Lou, they concluded that the doll itself was not truly possessed. Instead, it was being manipulated by an inhuman presence. According to the Warrens, spirits do not typically possess objects like dolls or houses. They possess people. What they described in this case was an inhuman or demonic entity attaching itself to an object to gain attention, while its true goal was to eventually possess a human host. The entity began its manipulation subtly, moving the doll around the apartment in ways that sparked curiosity and the unease. Its goal was to draw recognition, to be acknowledged by occupants, which it achieved, especially with Lou. Donna claims she tried to throw the Raggedy Ann doll in the trash. However, the doll reappeared inside the apartment shortly after, sometimes in a place where it had no way of being returned by normal means. But when Donna called in that medium to communicate with the doll, they unknowingly gave the spirit an opportunity to interact directly. Following this, the doll became the focal point of increasingly disturbed phenomena around the apartment. The spirit caused it to move on its own, create the handwritten notes, and left drops of what was described as symbolic blood. But most alarming was the attack on Lou, which the Warrens interpreted as a warning sign. I think at that point they were way past the signs of warning. In their view, this was the infestation stage of the entity's activity, its final goal being complete possession of a human. Had the events continued for another few weeks, the Warrens believed the spirit could have harmed or even killed one or more of the apartment's occupants. To prevent further escalation, the Warrens arranged for a blessing of the apartment. Father Cook, who had called the Warrens initially, recited an Episcopal blessing, a 7-page ritual designed to fill the home with positive energy rather than to explicitly expel the evil. The emphasis was on protecting the occupants and saturating the space with light and divine power. Finally, as an added precaution, and at Donna's request, the Warrens took the Raggedy Ann doll with them when they left that day. Now, Ed reportedly placed it in the backseat of his car, avoiding highways in case the alleged inhuman presence remained active. Ed claimed the car began to swerve and stall at each turn, with power steering and brakes failing, bringing the vehicle close to multiple collisions. He is also said to have doused the doll with holy water and made the sign of the cross over it, after which the disturbances allegedly ceased, allowing them to arrive home safely. Once at the Warrens' home, the doll was placed in the chair next to Ed's desk. Over the following weeks, they reported it levitated and appeared in various rooms of the house, sometimes returning to Ed's chair, even when locked elsewhere. The doll allegedly demonstrated an aversion to religion, especially Catholic priests. In one notable account, Father Jason Bradford, a visiting exorcist, was said to have been involved in a near-fatal car accident after handling the doll, later claiming it was the doll itself. Over time, the Warrens secured Annabelle in a special case at their occult museum in Monroe, Connecticut. Since being enclosed, she has reported to no longer move on her own. Now, I'm not going to discredit the Warrens, and my opinion is just that, my opinion. If you have an opinion on the Warrens, no matter what side of history you fall on, drop it in the comments because I'm open to hearing from all sides.
Right back after this commercial break.
Now, after the case was put to rest and Annabelle was safely tucked away in her glass enclosure, Ed and Lorraine Warren were prolific in sharing the details of the case. Annabelle became one of the most well-known paranormal cases in history, She appeared in books authored or co-authored by the Warrens, such as The Demonologist, The World's Most Haunted Places, and More Tales of the Unexplained, each recounting the events from their perspective. The doll, the scratches on Lou's chest, and the notes on parchment paper were described in detail, framed as evidence of a persistent inhuman presence. For readers, it was a story both fascinating and terrifying, an ultimate brush with the paranormal that seemed to exist just on the edge of belief. Now, beyond the books, the Warrens took their story on the road. Lectures and public appearances brought Annabelle into classrooms, auditoriums, and conference halls. Audiences listened raptly as they recounted the doll's manipulation, the seance, and the dangers of unseen forces and how you may let them in. Even episodes of The X-Files loosely replayed Annabelle's story to the world. But interviews on radio, television, and in magazines expanded reach even further. Appearances on shows like Sightings and segments in various publications allowed the Warrens to recount Lou's attacks, the unusual activity, and their handling of the doll, making themselves out to be heroes of the paranormal world. Journalists and hosts often approach the story with a mix of skepticism and intrigue, much like you and I do, framing the Warrens as either fearless investigators, but mostly opportunistic storytellers. The Warrens ensured that the story of Annabelle, the Raggedy Ann doll who moved, attacked, and almost possessed, reached a global audience and became a recognizable part of paranormal culture. Now let's fast forward to the year 2013. Annabelle Higgins, or at least the story inspired by her, was about to reach a whole new audience. The release of The Conjuring and its huge success brought the doll into theaters worldwide, reimagined as a sinister, porcelain-faced figure far different from the small Raggedy Ann doll housed in the Warrens Museum. Though only a small part in the original Conjuring film, Annabelle's appearance amplified every element of the story, emphasizing the danger that would drive future films in the expanding franchise centered around the Warrens. And it all began in 2014, when audiences were first introduced to the doll as a symbol of terror on her own, simply just as Annabelle. And it all began in 2014 when audiences were first introduced the doll as a symbol of terror as Annabelle was born in theaters worldwide.
Annabelle?
Now, I remember seeing this trailer in theaters and being hyped for the movie. Does the movie live up? Now that's another question. But no longer a cute little Raggedy Ann doll and now a porcelain pale-skinned doll straight out of Doll Island, with heightened dramatics and a complete reimagination of the story, a trilogy quickly took shape. Oddly enough, the star of the film was actor Annabelle Wallis. And much like most of the stories that followed in the Conjuring universe, it was told the way the Warrens wanted it to be told. Lorraine Warren served as a consultant on The Conjuring and even made a brief cameo appearance in the film. As part of the agreement surrounding the project, there were restrictions on how the Warrens could be portrayed, ensuring they were not depicted in certain ways. Now, after the success of the first Annabelle film, it was followed up by Annabelle Creation, a prequel that explored the doll's origins and established a version of Annabelle that existed almost entirely separate from the Warrens' original account. The films gave her a personality, intent, and a cinematic history, transforming a quiet, mysterious object into a fully realized antagonist, and now with a name and a backstory for viewers to grasp onto, when before, we had almost nothing. And it's here that we return to the real-life accounts, the people involved, and the events that inspired the legend. Because the films, for all their spectacle, only tell part of the story. The true story of Annabelle Higgins is far more fascinating than what appears on the screen, mostly because we don't know who she is. Lorraine passed away in 2019 and was honored with a dedication on screen in Annabelle Comes Home. Ed, having passed away in 2006, had no involvement in the series at all. When we strip the story back to what can be independently verified, the haunting of Annabelle is far less dramatic than the versions that surround it. The object at the center of all this is simply a Raggedy Ann doll. An ordinary, mass-produced soft toy with red yarn hair and a triangular nose that would not stand out except for the narratives attached to it. The claims that it moved on its own, walked from room to room, or physically attacked anyone have no contemporaneous documentation. And there are no police records, medical records, or independent eyewitness accounts that confirm these events ever occurred. Where's Donna? Where's Lou? Where are their writings? Experts who study folklore and paranormal claims point out that the only source for the original Annabelle narrative are the later testimonies of Ed and Lorraine Warren and secondary retellings based on them. There's no first-hand public testimony from Donna, Angie, or Lou themselves in archived records, interviews, or official documents. Every description of unusual phenomena comes through the Warrens' interpretation rather than the direct words of the people who allegedly experienced it. While there may be old interviews out there, they are well sought after online, and sleuths and paranormal enthusiasts have yet to uncover them. Skeptical investigators and researchers who look at the Annabelle story through a critical lens see it as part of a broader pattern in paranormal folklore. Outlets like the Encyclopedia of Urban Legends and researchers such as Benjamin Radford have noted that the haunted doll narratives often follow established storytelling patterns. An object is given a tragic backstory, unexplained occurrences are interpreted as paranormal, and the tale grows through repetition and embellishment over time. In this case, through a $2 billion franchise. Critics also highlight inconsistencies and changes in the Warrens' own retellings over the decades. Early news coverage and writings about the case differ from the later versions, including who was involved, what happened, and how the events went down. From a scientific perspective, and I know, I use the dirty word, science, it's said that objects do not trap spirits, nor is there empirical evidence that spirits can attach themselves to inanimate things like dolls. Many psychologists and cultural historians see haunted objects as psychological and sociological phenomena, stories people create to make sense of fear or unexplained events. The success of the Annabelle legend, in this view, reveals more about human imagination and cultural storytelling than about any genuine paranormal force. Does that mean it didn't happen? Of course not. But to believe in the paranormal is to also believe in debunking the paranormal, and in this case, we truly may never really know what happened. But what we do have is documented cases, especially some in recent events, that lean more towards the fact that there is something inside the doll. And what fun is believing if skeptics didn't exist to prove wrong? Now, when scrolling TikTok or Instagram Reels late at night, you're very frequently going to find influencers and paranormal investigators circling around Annabelle. The Warrens Occult Museum is now one of the hot spots for YouTubers and investigators to check out, especially now owned by a YouTuber himself, Elton Castee, and viral comedian Matt Rife. Since the ownership change, investigations are now private and fill up fast. Hopefully one day that changes and more people can experience the Warrens Occult Museum and lifetime of work. Or the supernatural sleuth who posted a video of Annabelle at Scarefest in Lexington, Kentucky, and what appears in her glass enclosure behind her is nothing short of mind-blowing. Those are also available on Instagram and TikTok. One of the earliest and most widely repeated stories tied to the Warrens Occult Museum involves a visitor who allegedly mocked the Annabelle doll. According to Tony Spera, the museum's caretaker and Lorraine Warren's son-in-law, a young man reportedly tapped on the glass case and taunted the doll. On his way home, he was killed in a motorcycle crash after running into a tree while his girlfriend survived. The couple had been talking about the doll moments before the accident. Over the years, Tony Spera himself has stated that museum visitors have reported a range of unusual experiences around the Annabelle case. Such reports include sudden dizziness or nausea near the display, nightmares involving the doll shortly after a visit, unexplained scratches or bruises, and electronic devices failing when people attempt to photograph or film the case. In 2025, one of the most recent events occurred as senior paranormal investigator Dan Rivera suddenly died while leading a nationwide tour featuring the Annabelle at their stop in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, a location already well known for tragedy. Local authorities reported no unusual circumstances at the scene, and the doll was not present in the room at the time of his death. The coroner said that Rivera had a known history of cardiac issues, which were consistent with the findings upon his autopsy. YouTubers Sam and Colby, while investigating the Annabelle doll, were able to work with Dan Rivera, and a dedication appears on the screen in what was one of his last videos that he was featured in. Now, could all of these be a coincidence tied to Annabelle? No one knows for sure, but what we do know is if you visit the Occult Museum, it's within your own best interest to be respectful to not only Annabelle, but the other haunted objects that surround her. In the internet age, stories grow, not just when people hear them once, but when they are repeated, visualized, and shared over and over across platforms. YouTube in particular has played a significant role in keeping the Annabelle narrative alive. Channels with millions of subscribers revisit the case, producing video essays, documentary-style breakdowns, and commentary on alleged encounters. Some creators like Elton, who runs the Overnight channel, Sam and Colby, like we just mentioned, and others publish content that keep Annabelle in the public eye. Their videos generate millions of views, driving further interest, clicks, and discussion. A full investigation of the Warrens' Occult Museum is now available on the Overnight channel for your viewing, whether you're a skeptic or a believer. When users search for Haunted Doll, the Conjuring Universe clips, museum footage, and commentary videos appear first, not historical records or critical analysis. Where are those videos? Where are those interviews with Donna, Angie, and Lou that the Warrens claim exist? Algorithms push content that garners engagement, and the Annabelle story checks every box. There's mystery, danger, visuals, and the narrative continues across films and now personal accounts. Encounters of Annabelle are very out there. Whether viewers approach the video skeptically or as believers, the sheer volume of content creates a social impression that the story is larger and more verified than it actually is. This is the nature of modern folklore. Stories that are repeated widely online come to feel real, even through mass exposure. Yet, in all of this attention, the actual human, if she ever existed at all, gets lost. We have no verified evidence that a real person named Annabelle Higgins lived, let alone that her spirit became attached to an object or was used as a vessel to do so. There is no birth record, no death certificate, no independent testimony outside of the narrative constructed by the Warrens and those who tell their version of the story. The face people associate with Annabelle in the movies is fictional. The doll people photograph in the museum is just a Raggedy Ann doll after all. The name itself appears only because it was reported during a seance that cannot be verified. And we cannot overlook the Conjuring Universe's depiction of Ed and Lorraine Warren, presented as a devoted New England couple gifted with the ability to confront evil. In reality, the Warrens lived as much in controversy as they did in fame. Numerous documentaries, including Devil's Road, the true story of Ed and Lorraine Warren, along with countless YouTube deep dives, explore their history, their cases, and the blurred line between legend and fact. Draw your own conclusions about them as people and human beings. But regardless of where you stand, their work and the conversations they spark within the paranormal community helped shape the landscape we continue to explore today. As of this recording, Annabelle lives in the Warrens' Occult Museum in Monroe, Connecticut, under the supervision of Elton Castee and his crew. According to HauntedWarrenMuseum.com, Annabelle will be moved to a new location starting in August 2026. It states, "New overnight dates coming soon. These dates will not have Annabelle or 15 other well-known Warren haunted artifacts in the museum during your stay. Everything else in the house will stay exactly the same. In August of 2026, we will be opening a new permanent museum in a public location where these items would move. Now, where that location is remains to be seen. Some rumors claim it to be Salem, but as of this recording right now, there has been no formal announcement. At its core, the tale of Annabelle reflects a broader pattern we see across history. Women and girls, real or imagined, become symbols or vessels for people's fear and interpretation. If Annabelle Higgins was a real person who lived and died, we do not know her story beyond what others have chosen to attribute to her. It's impossible to say what her personality was like, what her hopes were, or whether she left behind a family or friends who remembered her with love instead of lore. In the midst of all the videos, articles, and films, we should acknowledge that we simply do not have evidence of her existence beyond the testimonial narrative. And if Annabelle was ever a living person, we can only hope that she is at peace, no longer a character in a legend, and no longer disturbed by the narratives that have grown around her name. In the next episode, we step into a house built to confound the dead, where every hallway twists in ways that seem to defy logic, and every room tells the story of grief, obsession, and fear. We'll explore the life of Sarah Winchester, a woman whose choices were misunderstood and whose legacy became legend. I'm Johnny Clash, and this is Paranormal Unsettled. In the quiet city of San Jose stands a mansion that has puzzled visitors for more than a century. Known as the Winchester Mystery House, the home is filled with staircases that lead to ceilings, doors that open to thin air, and hallways that seem to twist and turn without any purpose. The legend follows the tale of the mansion's owner, Sarah Winchester, who built the house this way to confuse the ghosts trapped inside, the very spirits who linger in her presence seeking revenge for her family's wrongdoings. For decades, that haunting story has followed her name. But when we step beyond the legend and look at the historical record, the life of Sarah Winchester begins to tell a very different story. I'm Johnny Clash, a dad, a gamer, a former pro wrestler, and a lifelong observer of the unexplained. I'm not here to convince or dismiss. I'm here to document, to listen, and to stay with questions that do not resolve neatly. This is Paranormal Unsettled. The story of Sarah Lockwood Winchester begins not with ghosts or curses, but with a woman shaped by wealth, tragedy, and the pressures of an inheritance. Born into privilege and later married to William Wirt Winchester, heir to the Winchester Repeating Arms fortune, Sarah's life was marked by loss. By the time she inherited her wealth, she had already faced the death of her child and the sudden passing of her husband. In the midst of this grief and uncertainty, she purchased a small farmhouse in San Jose, California, intending to create a new home for herself. A home that would expand in ways that no one would predict. The mansion she began to build quickly became a labyrinth. From the outside, it appeared as though the house had no master plan, no guiding logic, yet each addition reflected decisions made by Sarah herself. Some say she was haunted by spirits, compelled to build endlessly. Others point to her personal grief, her obsessive attention to detail, and her desire for privacy as the driving force behind it. Or maybe she just needed the noise 24/7 to drown out the sounds from within. For more than a century, the focus has been on the supernatural. Sarah is a widow haunted by vengeful souls, endlessly building to ward off the dead. But the true story is far richer. It's a story of a woman navigating the pressures of wealth, the pain of loss, and the expectations of society. Sarah Winchester's legacy is a maze of history, myth, and misinterpretation, a common theme you're going to find in this season. And this is the legacy we will explore. The name Sarah Winchester has been inseparable from the strange mansion in San Jose, but to understand the legend, we must first understand the woman behind it. Born Sarah Lockwood Pardee in 1839, she came from a comfortable New Haven, Connecticut family. In 1862, she married William Wirt Winchester, try saying that 5 times fast, heir to the Winchester Repeating Arms Company, the maker of one of the most successful lever-action rifles in American history. William Winchester was part of a firearms dynasty. The company founded by his father and great-uncle produced the Winchester rifle, a weapon that became iconic during the post-Civil War expansion westward. The success of the rifles made the Winchester family wealthy, and Sarah, as William's wife, became part of that wealth. But as we know, wealth does not always bring happiness. Sarah was struck by a series of personal tragedies that would change her life and her story forever. The couple had one daughter, Annie Pardee Winchester, who was born on June 15, 1866, and died within only 1 month from a disease called marasmus. When William died of tuberculosis in 1881 at the age of 43, Sarah inherited a substantial portion of the company's fortune and a steady income from its ongoing profits. These losses devastated Sarah and left her isolated and grieving, and searching for purpose in a world that had taken nearly everyone she loved. After the loss, Sarah's doctor recommended moving to a warmer climate to help her rheumatoid arthritis. It was in 1881, following yet another loss, this time her older sister Mary Converse, that Sarah and her sisters decided to pack up and move to San Jose, California. And that's when she first laid eyes on Lanata Villa, which would soon become her personal project, and by 1886, the mystery as we know it began to take shape. It's from this period of grief that the legend begins to blur into something less grounded. The story suggests Sarah became obsessed with spirits and the afterlife, seeking guidance on how to cope with her losses. Some versions of the story claim that she consulted mediums who told her that the deaths in her family were caused by spirits of those killed by Winchester rifles, and that she could escape her own tragedy only by continuously building a house for the dead. The mansion she began to build where a farmhouse once stood supposedly grew out of this belief. The purpose of the house would be to confuse and appease the spirits she feared were following her. Doors were built where there were no stairs, staircases that led to ceilings, windows facing other walls. These architectural oddities were deliberate attempts to thwart off malicious spirits, and it was done with over 10,000 panes of glass. Within the first 6 months of construction, Sarah Winchester's home had already grown to 26 rooms. Influenced by expositions she would attend and her personal tastes, she filled the house with intricate statues, patterned hardwood floors of teak and mahogany, embossed wall coverings, stenciled ceilings, German chandeliers, Asian furnishings, and French paintings. The surrounding gardens were equally elaborate, with plants sourced from over 110 countries. Although she hired architects, Sarah often took control of the project herself, supervising carpenters and managing each room's design. She subscribed to architectural journals and made detailed drawings of what she wanted. Rooms were built, torn down, or abandoned and rebuilt at her discretion, producing a sprawling maze-like layout. Some upper-level windows feature spiderweb tracery, and others incorporate Shakespearean quotes from Richard II or Troilus and Cressida. After 1896, Sarah added multiple stories in sections of the house, including a 7-story tower that was rebuilt 16 times before she was satisfied. She incorporated modern plumbing and electrical systems, an indoor garden with irrigation, and even an annunciator system to summon servants, which was one of the many new groundbreaking pieces of technology developed for this house. During this period of construction, yet another personal tragedy took place. In 1893, her youngest sister, Estelle Party Gerard, became gravely ill and was moved to the Lanata Villa property in hope that the drier climate would improve her health. Despite treatment from Winchester's personal physician, Gerard died in January of 1894 from cirrhosis, adding to the layers of grief and loss in Sarah Winchester's life that she seemed unable to escape. Over time, the story and the narrative behind Sarah Winchester and her reasoning expanded into ghost lore and rumors passed down. Sarah never stopped building, working day and night until her death in 1922, because the spirits would never let her rest. Workers were said to have been hired in shifts around the clock, and the sound of hammers and saws was reported day and night. In this way, Sarah was never alone. But the reality of her later years tells a different story, a more human one. As she aged, Sarah's health declined significantly. Severe arthritis left her hands and feet disfigured, making it difficult to walk or even write. She relied on assistance from her niece Daisy and a stenographer for correspondence, and later hired a trusted nurse and secretary, Henrietta Severa, who remained with her until the end. By the 1920s, Sarah rarely left her home, often shopping by mail or from her carriage rather than venturing out herself. And you can see in the one picture that exists of Sarah Winchester, she's in that very carriage. In September of 1922, she was moved closer to her doctor in San Jose. Days later, on September 5th, she passed away. She was laid to rest beside her husband and her daughter in New Haven. Her estate, though once rumored to be astronomically vast beyond measure, was valued at a more modest $3 to $4 million. In her will, she provided for her family and several loyal employees, leaving behind a legacy that was far more practical than the myths that would follow. After her death, most of her properties were sold off. The home itself, considered too unusual and in poor condition to be easily repurposed, was eventually opened to the public just months later, transforming from a private residence into a tourist attraction, and that's how it remains today. The Winchester Mystery House became a monument to spiritual fear. It wasn't long before Hollywood came calling. In the retellings that follow, Sarah Winchester is no longer a grieving widow who inherited wealth and chose to build an unusual home. She has become a ghost figure in her own story. A haunted woman driven by fear, trapped by voices, and forever linked to the spirits that folklore claimed she could neither escape nor appease.
We'll be right back after this commercial break.
By the early 20th century, long before horror movies or paranormal TV shows, the myth of Sarah Winchester as a crazy old woman had already taken root in pop culture. Newspapers and magazines covering the Winchester Mystery House focused less on architectural curiosity and more on Sarah herself. This portrayal was amplified in the mid-20th century as ghost stories and haunted lore grew. Headlines and show titles leaned into phrases like "the woman who built the house for ghosts," which could easily be taken as derogatory. These early articles laid the groundwork for a caricature that would persist for generations, one in which Sarah was not a grieving widow making unique personal choices, but a figure obsessed with life after death and somehow escaping it in her maze of a home. In 2018, Hollywood took interest in Sarah and her story. The film Winchester brought a new wave of interpretation to the tale, and a tale it was.
I feel their presence in the air, in the walls. It has found us.
Starring Helen Mirren as Sarah Winchester, the movie presented the story with the framework passed down for generations. Sarah, a mysterious widow, haunted by the spirits of those killed by the Winchester rifles, compelled to build endlessly to keep them at bay. Until, of course, they couldn't be contained any longer. Though marketed as inspired by true events, The film leaned heavily on horror tropes with jump scares galore. This made for a dramatic movie that sits at a 5.5 on IMDb and a 12% on Rotten Tomatoes, but sits far outside the documented historical record. In the movie's version of events, Sarah suffered from nightmares and hallucinatory experiences tied to the deaths, as does her nephew. It uses typical horror movie scares like ghostly voice, warnings from spirits, and not to mention a possessed child. While Helen Mirren's performance is spectacular as usual, the story the film tells is one shaped by genre expectations. The grief Sarah experienced takes a far back seat and is only briefly mentioned in the story. Many people today encounter Sarah Winchester not as a historical figure, but as a character in a horror narrative, one who lost her mind, not one who lost just about everything else. And that, more than any architectural quirk of the mansion itself, is the cultural echo that still lingers. Now the truth. The real story of Sarah Winchester is less about ghosts and more so about a wealthy widow who faced immense personal loss and how one would react to it without the benefit of modern therapy or honest doctoring. As we saw with places like Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum last season, you can be locked up for just about anything, especially being a woman. Luckily, Sarah was powerful and wealthy, which in this sense helped her story. But all in all, Sarah Winchester was a grieving widow with determination and vision. Her legacy should be molded about architectural perseverance and overcoming such personal loss, not spiritual terror. The facts reveal a story of a human resilience and creativity more compelling than any ghost story could capture. Now, before we dive into reports of hauntings at the Winchester Mystery House, a quick note. Much like Ed and Lorraine Warren in the previous episode, I will be taking anything associated with Zach Baggins with a very, very large grain of salt and do not condone any alleged accusations against him. I also don't know how one man can be possessed so many times, but hey, it makes for good television, and the evidence still must be studied. Let's take a look at what evidence does exist out there in the Winchester house. Over the years, countless paranormal investigators have tried to document what the legend claims. The TAPS team from Ghost Hunters visited the mansion hoping to capture proof of the lingering spirits, or maybe even Sarah herself, though she did not die in the mansion. They recorded long hours of footage, even with electrical troubles, and searched the few rooms they were given access to. What did they find? Absolutely nothing. No apparitions, no mysterious sounds, no poltergeist activity, just the ability to free roam this historic building, learning about its curiosities and admiring the architecture. They even had to take their shoes off to enter the Great Ballroom. For all the reports of staircases to nowhere and doors that open on their own, the investigators came away empty-handed. In their episode, they admitted that the house itself, while fascinating, offered no evidence of supernatural forces. The split episode coverage with the Queen Mary made for an interesting contrast in locations, yet both appeared with minimal activity. You can find this episode in Season 2, Episode 11 on the Ghost Hunters official YouTube. Of course, with a house so popular, the investigations don't stop there, and progress as paranormal media did. Like I mentioned at the start of this segment, in Season 5, Episode 4, Zach Baggins and Ghost Adventures took on the Mystery House as well. In their investigation, the team set up cameras, audio equipment, thermal imaging devices, and EMF detectors throughout the mansion. They focused on areas tied to the legend of Sarah herself, including the beautiful Grand Ballroom, where she reportedly held seances to communicate with spirits, though that information is unverified. Throughout the night, they experienced doors slamming, strange noises, and unexplained shadows. In the Grand Ballroom, spikes in EMF readings suggested to the team that an unseen presence may have been communicating with them. The team also explored the cabinet room, which is said to be haunted by the spirit of a young girl. Using a laser grid and air pressure sensors, they recorded multiple disturbances of a pattern and sensed an unknown presence with them. In the basement, another site linked to Sarah's alleged communications with spirits, the investigators captured an EVP that sounded like a child saying hello, despite no children being present at the time of the investigation. Despite all of this, the team was unable to provide definitive proof of a haunting and concluded that while the mansion's bizarre layout and the tragic history of the Winchester family make it an incredibly unique and mysterious location, the evidence remained inconclusive. Now, YouTube is flooded with Winchester investigations, so actually if you found this video, thank you. Hundreds of videos from visitors and popular YouTubers like Sam and Colby, Paranormal Quest, Mackie and Amanda, and Overnight by Elton Castee. But if you ask the people who actually work there, or have spent serious time in the mansion itself, some of the most frequently shared stories aren't from TV and YouTube, but from regular tours, maintenance crews, and longtime observers. One of the most commonly repeated experiences among staff and visitors is the presence of a figure nicknamed Clyde. Employees have described seeing a mustached man in the basement, often near the old fireplace or wheelbarrow, as if he's still tending to unfinished work. He is described as wearing Victorian work clothes, which has become a staple of the mansion's ghost lore. Though there's no historical record linking such a person to the house's actual construction, but with many workers and long hours, it's definitely possible. Other staff accounts include sudden cold spots and footsteps where no one is visible. But in a house so weird and a house so large, it could be anything. One longtime maintenance worker reported walking up through a restricted water tower only to hear footsteps directly above him. When he climbed to investigate, the sounds always remained one step ahead, even on floors and roof areas where no one should have been. Some tour guides have likewise said that the visitors occasionally feel light tugs on their clothing as they move through long hallways or near fireplaces, despite no one being nearby. Another well-circulated story comes from a former night watch couple who lived on the property during the 1970s and early 1980s. They described late-night alarm activations with no clear cause, odd movements sensed in the hallways, and a security dog that hesitated at certain corridors of the mansion. One of them also reported seeing movement out of the corner of his eye near a statue, a moment he described as unsettling enough that the chill stayed with him years later. While the evidence is enticing, many historians and skeptics point out that large, drafty Victorian houses commonly produce cold spots, creaks, and isolated noises due to settling wood, temperature shifts, or, the architectural quirks. And this house certainly has plenty of those. But the persistence of the stories, especially when shared over and over on YouTube and through word of mouth, keeps the ideas of haunting alive. Could there be something lingering? Is Sarah still present within those curved walls? Or could it be the mystique and the architecture coming to life? So is Sarah still haunting her old mansion? Nobody knows for sure, and we may never. What stays in this story is not a spirit, but the fascination with Sarah Winchester herself. And who is more vulnerable than a grieving widow to be spun into a narrative that she was crazy and spoke to ghosts? Maybe she simply had a love for architecture from all over the world. Maybe she wanted to build something so lavish and vast that her family, the tragedies she endured, and those who died before her would be remembered forever. The house was the monument. The truth is, Sarah was a well-educated woman who had every right to create whatever she wanted on her property with her own family's wealth. If there is something else still lingering on this property, perhaps they too are just shadows of the past. Echoes of a family, a house, and a story that will never be forgotten. Today, the Winchester Mystery House is more than just a legend. It's a destination. Visitors can walk its winding halls on guided tours, attend special events, even book weddings, or participate in paranormal investigations. For those who can't make it to San Jose, there's a virtual tour available for just $8.99 at 360tourwmh.com. This tour offers a detailed look at the mansion's unique rooms and history from anywhere in the world at your fingertips. Whether in person or online, the house continues to capture the imagination, reminding us that some stories linger not because of ghosts, but because of the lives, tragedies, and mysteries that shape them. The Winchester Mystery House stands as a testament to Sarah Winchester, her vision, her grief, and the enduring fascination that surrounds her name. May Sarah and her family rest in peace, and whatever lingers here be nothing more than a reminder of a life lived, a home built, and stories that continue to captivate us without causing harm. In the next episode, we step into the misty forests and early settlements of colonial Maryland, where fear and superstition shaped daily life and grief could be mistaken for malevolence. We'll explore the life of Maul Dyer, a woman whose choices were misunderstood, whose struggles became a legend, and whose story reminds us that history often blurs the lines between fact and folklore. I'm Johnny Clash, and this is Paranormal Unsettled. In the quiet forests and marshlands of 17th century colonial America, there is a story that has lingered for more than 3 centuries in Leonardtown, Maryland. A story of fear, accusation, and a winter night that would turn a woman into more than just a legend. She is known as Maul Dyer, a woman said to be accused of witchcraft and driven from her home by the very people who once lived beside her. The tale claims she fled into the freezing wilderness, and days later her body was found beside a large stone, partially frozen as if the earth itself had claimed her. Over time, her story became something more: a warning, a myth, a haunting tied to the land she once walked. For generations, that version of events has been passed down, growing colder and darker with every retelling. But when we step beyond the legend and look closer at what history can actually tell us, the story of Maul Dyer begins to shift in unexpected ways. I'm Johnny Clash, a dad, a gamer, a former pro wrestler, and a lifelong observer of the unexplained. I'm not here to convince or dismiss. I'm here to document, to listen, and to stay with questions that do not resolve neatly. This is Paranormal Unsettled. The story of Maul Dyer begins in the harsh winters of 1697 in Leonardtown, Maryland, a time and place where fear of the unknown could shape a community. Whispers of witchcraft, misfortune, and curses spread quickly, and the line between fact and legend was very thin. Maul Dyer's life, like many women of her time, was defined by hardship. She was a widow, a mother, and a member of a small colonial town. She was vulnerable to suspicion and rumor, much like anyone else who seemed out of place. The events that would seal her name in folklore started quietly, with neighbors noting unexplained happenings, small incidents that would later be magnified into tales of malice and witchcraft. In this episode, we will explore how a woman becomes a legend, separating the chilling myth from the historical reality. From the frozen nights she allegedly fled to the stone where she was found, to the lingering stories that haunted Leonardtown for centuries, Maul Dyer's story reminds us that history often remembers women for the fears they inspired, rather than the lives they led. The legend of Maul Dyer is chilling in both a literal sense and emotional. Her story is an enduring folktale rooted in the oral histories of St. Mary's County in Maryland. Though historians caution that no primary documents confirm her life or death, the story has persisted for centuries, passed down from generations to generation, and has grown into something even bigger. Maul Dyer was said to be a 17th century colonist living in Leonardtown during the harsh winters of 1697, a period marked by famine, disease, and fear of the unknown. These were the same years as the Maryland witch trials, which resulted in multiple accusations and only one documented execution, and the climate of suspicion and superstition set the stage for Moll's story to take root. What many do not know is the witch trials did not start in Salem, though they may be the most notable. The Connecticut witch trials began in 1647, followed by the Maryland witch trials in 1654 and Salem in 1692, which defined a generation. And if you think back to what the witch trials were, what they became, how ridiculous it is. It's crazy that they ever even happened to begin with. According to the folktale, Moll was an older woman living on the outskirts of town when the community, desperate to explain a series of misfortunes, accused her of witchcraft. No, she didn't have a cauldron, she wasn't casting spells, and she certainly didn't ride a broom. The misfortunes they speak of were crops had suddenly failed, livestock had mysteriously died, and a deadly plague had spread across the town. At a meeting in the local shop, the town determined that Moll Dyer was the witch who called upon the devil to terrorize Leonardtown. In the eyes of her neighbors, her friends, her peers, these tragedies were the work of dark magic with no other explanation. So one day a mob gathered, intent on driving Moll from her home. They set fire to her cottage, and Moll fled into the icy night, wrapped only in a light shawl, pursued by those who feared her, but probably full of fear herself. Exhausted and frozen, she eventually collapsed on a large boulder where, according to legend, she raised her hands to the moon and cast one final curse to the people of Leonardtown. Now the story varies depending on who tells it. Some claim her hand or knees left impressions in the stone, which came to be known as Moll Dyer's Rock. Other versions describe the curse as bringing blighted crops, infertility, child mortality, or even more misfortune to those who wronged her. Her body was allegedly found a few days later, frozen to the stone, though no historical record confirms this ever happened. Could it be a town sweeping it under a rug per se, in a time where documentation was easily mishandled? But despite the lack of documentation, her story has been referenced in local newspapers, historical journals, and oral histories over the centuries, such as the Baltimore Sun in 1974, with a reenactment of Moll's final pose and a now well-known drawing done by Maria B. Holmes. Researchers and folklorists have tried to trace a real person behind the legend for decades. Some point to Mary Dyer, or other variations of the name, who appear in 17th century immigration records and colonial documents. A Mary Dyer, possibly born in Devon, England, in 1634, traveled to Maryland in 1677 as an indentured servant. While it's unknown if she ever lived in Leonardtown, the connection has been drawn repeatedly by storytellers. Could this be Moll all along and the name just got switched up in that ever-long game of telephone? Other accounts suggest Moll may have come from Ireland, New England, or Virginia, or that she was a widow, spinster, or even a woman scorned in love. Across all of these tellings, however, the certainty of her identity is as elusive as the legend itself. The rock itself was rediscovered in the 1960s and moved in 1972 by the National Guard to the Leonardtown Courthouse lawn. Today, it resides at Tudor Hall under a protective plexiglass case with a plaque retelling the legend and a headline that reads, "Approach the Moll Dyer Rock with caution." Visitors to the rock have reported feeling dizzy, nauseous, or otherwise unnerved, and local tradition holds that offerings of flowers or trinkets may ward off any unwelcome spirits.
Right back after this crucial break.
One of the most popular media portrayals of Moll Dyer came through television. On October 5th, 2014, the Weather Channel aired an episode of American Supernatural that explored the legend. The program told the story of her exile, her curse, and her death, visiting sites such as Malldire Road, which is a branch off of Maryland's Route 5 that is said to be the site of either her home or death, and of course the relocated Malldire's Rock. It's unclear where those locations exactly were. The episode highlighted reports of strange phenomena in the area, while acknowledging the lack of evidence. And we will get to that evidence in just a minute. Literature has also played a significant role in keeping Mall's story alive. In 2017, a local novelist, David W. Thompson, published Sister Witch, The Life of Malldire, compiling historical research, oral histories, and regional folklore to create a cohesive narrative around her life and the legend. Similarly, in 2020, Mike Marcus included the tale in Malldire's Revenge, an anthology of horror short stories published by War Monkey Publications. Both works take the legend seriously while exploring its themes of superstition, marginalization, and the fear of the unknown. Now, the story of Mall extends even beyond literature. It has been cited as one of the inspirations for the 1999 film, The Blair Witch Project, which also centers on a female figure accused of witchcraft and her connection to a cursed location. Though the film does not directly reference Mall, the parallels between the folklore of an unseen, haunting female presence and the cinematic narrative of terror demonstrate the legend's broad cultural resonance. Little did they know, the Blair Witch Project would become a groundbreaking piece in Hollywood and the start of many more found footage films, including a Blair Witch remake in 2016. And I believe we're getting another one in the next few years. Malldire is also portrayed in the 2013 TV series Sleepy Hollow, played by Sarah Sanderson. Performance arts have also embraced Mall's narrative. Between 1999 and 2006, the St. Mary's Ballet Company, under founder Jane Caputo, choreographed The Legend of the Witch, Malldire, set to the music of Lorena McKennon. The ballet was performed at St. Mary's Riken High School and at the College of Southern Maryland's Leonardtown campus as part of local Halloween celebrations. It reimagined Mall not merely as a figure of fear, but as a morality tale of resilience, tolerance, and misunderstood womanhood. Even local traditions and community events help keep her story alive. In 2021, Leonardtown Mayor Dan Burris proclaimed an event in late February known as Malldire Day, where a festival takes place honoring the legend as part of the town's history. The full schedule can be found at visitleonardtownmd.com/Malldire Day, featuring a Malldire-themed cocktail contest, paranormal tours, scavenger hunts, and a make-your-own-potions activity. And, unsurprisingly, a flood of negative comments and angry emoji reactions on their Facebook page from critics who object to profiting off the story of a woman wrongly accused and ultimately condemned. But I digress. Residents often leave small offerings, flowers, sweets, trinkets at the Malldire Rock. Could the town be celebrating a misunderstood woman who was once accused of something unspeakable? Or are they leaving offerings in hope that the spirit of Malldire doesn't have one more curse left in her? Whether it is just a cautionary tale or a figure of resilience, or just a spectral presence, Malldire's story gets stronger the more it's told. Despite the legend that has grown around her, like we mentioned earlier, there is no definitive historical record of Malldire ever living in Leonardtown, Maryland. Primary sources such as death certificates, court records, or contemporary accounts documenting her existence have never been found. Leonardtown's colonial records are incomplete, largely due to the courthouse fire of March 8, 1831, which destroyed many official documents from the 17th and 18th centuries. While Mall was a common nickname for Mary, there is no evidence linking any other woman with similar names, such as Mary Dyer, to Leonardtown, nor is there any record of them being accused of witchcraft. Historians do note that most witchcraft prosecutions in Maryland were rare compared to New England, with Rebecca Fowler of Calvert County being one of the few documented cases resulting in execution in 1685. Now, oral histories collected in the 20th century provide much of what is widely considered evidence for Muldaur. Interviews conducted by Thomas Jarboe in 1994 with longtime residents and local historians indicate that the details of her life vary widely. She may have been a widow, may have been a spinster. Was she a mother or even a Native American maid? Depending on the source, the story is different. Dates of her death range from mid-1600s to the late 1700s, and her alleged cottage location is speculative, with no archaeological confirmation. The so-called Muldaur Rock is often cited as proof of her curse. However, accounts of discolored handprints or supernatural effects appear only in the retellings from the late 19th and 20th centuries. This just shows what folklore can do to transforming an ordinary object into a marker of a legend. Now, while that legend casts her in such a dark light, perhaps all of those misfortunes were just a sign of the times. Epidemics, harsh winters, social tension, this was all common in 17th century Leonardtown, and these conditions just contributed to Muldaur's narrative. Her life and death remain unverified. The historical records provide little beyond general references to a woman named Mary or Margaret, while the detailed stories of curses, mob attacks, and supernatural phenomena exist entirely in this folklore. Any discussion of hauntings, handprints, or retribution reflects maybe just myth rather than documented fact. Now let's talk about The Rock. No, not Dwayne. The Muldaur Rock was lost for centuries until 1968, when Philip H. Love, a Washington Evening Star writer, located it with the help from a local grocer who remembered the stone from childhood. In 1972, the 875-pound limestone boulder was moved by the National Guard to the Leonardtown Courthouse lawn, marked with a simple plaque reading Muldaur Rock circa 1697. It remained here for nearly 50 years before being relocated in early 2021 by the St. Mary's County Historical Society to Tudor Hall. Today, the rock is protected under plexiglass with an updated plaque. Now, while the rock itself is just a monument and not compelling enough for paranormal teams to really fully investigate, there has been some evidence captured over time. Sightings of her ghost have been reported, particularly near Muldaur Road and the nearby creek, often accompanied by a spectral white dog that allegedly causes motorists to swerve on the winding road. Now, visitors to Muldaur Rock describe unusual experiences when touching the stone, including dizziness, illness, and a feeling of intense energy. Apparitions, disembodied voices, and sudden gusts of wind have also been reported, suggesting maybe a lingering presence tied to the legend is still there at the rock. Author Michael M. Hughes recounted visiting the site, noting a palpable energy surrounding the rock. He experienced unusual technical malfunctions. His iPhone gimbal repeatedly failed while filming, which never happened before and ceased once he left. While we probably won't get a full ghost hunters investigation on Muldaur, the location of the rock and the tale behind it is open to the public, on the grass outside of Tudor Hall in Leonardtown, Maryland. Maybe Ghost Adventures will visit and the spirit of Muldaur will make Zach Baggins double over in pain. Who knows? So why does Muldaur's story stand the test of time? Perhaps because it touches on a broader history of fear, superstition, and the persecution of women. During the 17th century, witch trials swept through Maryland and much of the colonies, targeting women who were vulnerable, outspoken, or simply just misunderstood. Moll fits all of these categories, and her legend reflects the ways communities projected blame onto those who didn't conform, turning their tragedy into accusation. Could you imagine how they felt? As far as history tells, there was no incriminating evidence against Moll. A crowd determined she was guilty entirely based on their own fears and the social context. There was no factual, no legal proof. They took matters into their own hands. Being a widow and being an outcast or otherwise independent woman just made her a target. Her tale persists not only because of the dramatics of the time surrounding it, but because it symbolizes the injustice faced by women in her era, and still to this day. The fear of witchcraft combined with the harsh realities of colonial life created fertile ground for a story that has been retold for centuries, and a story no one may ever know if it truly did happen. In the end, what lingers is less about the supernatural and more about the memory of a woman caught in the world that judged her unfairly. Moll Dyer remains a figure who embodies the tension between myth and history, reminding us of the real dangers of fear. May Moll Dyer rest in peace wherever she may be, if she indeed is a free spirit or just a figment of a horrible time. May she be free from the fear and judgment that shadowed her life. The stories that survive of a woman fleeing a mob, of a frozen hand on a stone, of the legends that grew around her, remind us of the consequences of superstition and the resilience of those misunderstood by history. Whether seen as a myth, just a memory, or something in between, Moll's presence survives in the landscape, in the rock that bears her name, and the imagination of those who remember her. Perhaps it's not a curse that lingers, but a story. One that calls us to consider the lives of women whose truths were never fully heard. In the next episode, we journey to the haunted hills of Adams, Tennessee, where a family's home became the stage for one of America's most infamous poltergeist cases. We'll explore the Bell family and the entity known as Kate, the Bell Witch, a presence that terrorized a community, tested faith, and left a story that has echoed through centuries, blurring the line between history and legend. I'm Johnny Clash, and this is Paranormal Unsettled. On a quiet farm in Adams, Tennessee, a family once claimed that they were being tormented by something they could not see and they could not stop. The legend follows a spirit known as Kate, a voice in the dark that knocked on walls, pulled children from their sleep, and waged a years-long campaign of torment against a man named John Bell. A presence so persistent, so deliberate, that some say it followed him all the way to his grave. That story has echoed for over 200 years, but when we step beyond the legend and look at what the historical records actually shows, the Bell farm begins to tell a far different, complicated story. I'm Johnny Clash, a dad, a gamer, a former pro wrestler, and a lifelong observer of the unexplained. I'm not here to convince or dismiss. I'm here to document, to listen, and to stay with questions that do not resolve neatly. This is Paranormal Unsettled. In Adams, Tennessee, there is a cave carved into the earth along the bank of the Red River. It feels cool inside, even in the height of summer. The walls are limestone. The air is still. People travel from across the country to stand at its mouth and listen. They are not sure what they are listening for, but most of them will tell you they feel something. The cave sits on land that once belonged to a family named Bell. A father, a mother, children, a farm. A life that by all accounts was ordinary. Until one day, it wasn't. Before the name Kate was ever even spoken, there was a family living through something they couldn't explain. A father working his land, a mother trying to hold her home together while something unseen tore at it from within. And their daughter Betsy, just 15 years old, who would carry whatever happened there with her for the rest of her life, never fully explaining what she experienced. This episode is about Kate, but it's also about the Bells, about what gets remembered, what gets distorted, and what quietly disappears over time, and who gets the blame. The cave is still there, the land hasn't changed, and whatever happened on that farm left something behind that nearly 2 centuries haven't erased. So let's start at the beginning with the legend itself. Before we can separate what's real and what isn't, we need to understand what's been told for more than 2 centuries. It's 1817, Middle Tennessee. The land is still being settled. The nights are long, and the Bell family, John, Lucy, and their 9 children, though that number has been questioned over the years, are living what would be considered a stable, even prosperous life in Robertson County. They're devout, well-respected, active in the church. John is known as a hard-working farmer. Lucy as a kind of trusted presence in the community. And their daughter Betsy, a teenager, is described as bright and full of life. John Bell was the first to witness something unusual, describing a strange animal on his property that looked like a dog, but with a rabbit's head. He fired at it, but it disappeared. Around the same time, other members of the family began reporting things that didn't seem to make sense. His son Drew approached a bird perched on a fence that suddenly flew off, described as unnaturally large. Betsy Bell claimed to see a girl in a green dress swinging from a tree. Even others on the property reported being followed by animals that vanished just as quickly as they appeared. But then the activity moved inside the home. Knocking sounds echoed through the walls and doors. The family heard gnawing noises on the bedposts, chains dragging across the floor, and what sounded like animals fighting in empty rooms. As the disturbances continued, John Bell began experiencing physical symptoms, including paralysis in his mouth. What had started as unexplained noises was becoming something more direct. But then the activity escalated. The children began waking at night as their bed covers were pulled away. Invisible hands scratching them, pulling their hair, and in some cases, these left marks. Betsy became the primary focus of these attacks. She was slapped, pinched, struck with what felt like pins, often in front of others. The family could find no source for what was happening, and they tore up their property to get to the bottom of it. Looking for answers, the Bell turned to a trusted friend, James Johnson. After spending a night in the home, Johnson experienced the same disturbances and concluded that what they were dealing with was, in his words, a spirit. From there, word spread quickly. People began traveling from surrounding areas to witness it for themselves, which only amplified everything. Not long after, the entity began to speak. At first, the voice was faint. Then it became clear. It answered questions, held conversations, and demonstrated an unusual familiarity with religious texts, often quoting scripture and engaging in theological debate. It could repeat sermons given miles apart, share detailed information about other households, and even mimic voices it had supposedly never heard in person. Visitors attempted to test it, asking questions only they would know. In some cases, the responses were accurate enough to unsettle even the skeptics. When asked who it was, the voice gave different answers. At one point, it claimed to be a spirit that had once been happy, but was now disturbed. In other accounts, it tied itself to the land, referencing a native burial site. Eventually, it associated itself with a local woman named Kate Batts, claiming to be old Kate Batts' witch. The name stayed. From that point on, the entity just simply became known as Kate. And Kate's behavior was not consistent. It showed kindness towards Lucy Bell, speaking gently to her, singing hymns, and even bringing her fruit. It also showed a level of respect towards John Bell Jr., but towards John Bell itself, it was openly hostile. It referred to him as Old Jack, threatening him and revealing its intentions to kill him. And that it did. Over time, John's health declined, with symptoms that left him increasingly weak as the days went on. One part of the legend involves a man named William Porter, who reportedly tried to confront the entity directly. The story goes, he managed to grab the unseen presence and attempted to burn it in the fireplace, believing it could be destroyed like something physical. The moment he did, he was violently thrown back as if struck by an unseen force. The weight and foul odor became too much and he quickly abandoned the attempt. But this legend reaches its peak in 1820. Mission accomplished. John Bell was found unresponsive and a small vial of unknown liquid was discovered nearby his bedside. The strange substance was tested on a cat, which died shortly after. But there was no question who committed such an act. Kate claimed responsibility, saying that she poisoned him. Following his death, the voice was said to mock the situation, even interrupting those mourning John Bell with songs. But the disturbances did not end there. The entity also played a role in the life of Betsy Bell, expressing strong opposition to her engagement to a local man named Joshua Gardner. Under continued pressure and influence from Kate, Betsy eventually called off the engagement in 1821. Not long after, the entity announced it would leave, but promised to return in only 7 years. And as the story goes, it did return in 1828, briefly interacting with members of the Bell family, making predictions of the Civil War and World War I, even predicting the end of the world before completely disappearing again. Over time, additional details were added to the story. One of the most famous involves Andrew Jackson, who is said to have visited the property. After spending one night on the farm, Andrew Jackson claimed, "I would rather face the entire British Army than to spend another night with the Bell Witch." But who was Kate? Who was the Bell Witch? Why did she claim this family and bring John Bell Sr. to his deathbed? Some say Kate Batts was a neighbor who John Bell cheated out of land. Some say she still lingers in the cave today, cursing those who take something, even as small as a pebble.
We'll be right back after this commercial break.
Here's the thing about folklore. It doesn't stay still. It doesn't always tell the same story over and over again. The more it's told, the more things change. Every generation that touches a story leaves fingerprints on it, and the Bell Witch has a lot of hands on it over the years. The story wasn't widely published until 1894, nearly 75 years after the events allegedly took place. A man named Martin Van Buren Ingram wrote a book called An Authenticated History of the Famous Bell Witch of Tennessee, which he claimed was based on a journal kept by John Bell's son, Richard Williams Bell. Ingram's book shaped everything that came after. Every campfire retelling, every newspaper article, every documentary drew from that well. And because it was framed as authenticated history, people treated it as a fact. And then as we've seen, and as they do, Hollywood got a hold of it. In 2005, an American haunting hit theaters.
Something evil here.
Who's there? Show yourself!
We didn't imagine any of this. You were there, you saw it.
It dramatized the Bell Witch story with a very specific interpretation. One that mapped the haunting onto an allegation of sexual abuse by John Bell against Betsy, framing the supernatural events as a kind of psychological manifestation of trauma. It's a compelling angle for sure, but it's also almost entirely invented for the film. It's not rooted in the historical record. But after that movie, that interpretation became part of how many people think about the story. Then came The Bell Witch Haunting in 2013, a found footage film with a whopping 3.6 out of 10 stars on IMDb that borrowed the name and location and ran in almost an entirely different direction. More jump scares, less historical grounding, fine as entertainment, but another layer of fiction draped over an already complicated truth. And that seems to be the trend we're seeing this season with every single case we're examining. Many others also believed to be influenced by the story of the Bell Witch, such as Poltergeist, Paranormal Activity, The Witch, and even the Blair Witch Project, which we mentioned last week, was based on Maud Dyer and is receiving a brand new revive in the coming years. There's also the local tourism industry to consider. And I say that without judgment, because the people of Adams, Tennessee deserve to benefit from something that has put their small town on the map. The Bell Witch Cave, a limestone cave on the property once owned by the Bell family, draws visitors from across the country. The cave has become part of the legend. People report strange experiences there, whispers, cold spots, equipment malfunctions. There have even been people that have taken something so small, something like a rock, and felt the curse of the Bell Witch when they went home. They would return the rock with a letter apologizing to the Bell Witch. Now, whether those experiences are real or not may be exaggerated. They are real to the people having them, and that matters. But the risk of tourism, of pop culture, of 2 centuries of retellings is this. The actual human story gets buried. A family with real people, real children, lived through something that terrified them. Whatever that something was, their suffering was genuine, as was Kate's. And sometimes, in a rush to sell tickets and make movies, that gets lost. The human aspect. So let's try to get that back. The truth, as usual, is messier and more interesting than the legend, but in a different way. Let's start with what we can actually confirm. The Bell family was real. John, Lucy, and their children, even though the number is debated, lived in Robertson County, Tennessee in the early 19th century. John Bell did die in December of 1820. His death is documented and is the only documented death in history that is attributed to supernatural causes. The family's existence is well documented. Neighbors and visitors wrote about the unusual events that occurred at the Bell farm. That much is real. What is not confirmed is almost everything else. The primary source, Richard Bell's alleged journal, was not published until Ingram's 1894 book. And by that point, everyone who could have confirmed or denied its authenticity was long dead. Richard Bell himself died in 1890, 4 years before the book was published. We are relying on Ingram's words that his journal existed and that he faithfully transcribed it. Historians who have looked closely at the timeline point out that the story, as published in 1894, contains details that feel more like literary embellishment than eyewitness accounts, but that's something we can expect from the time. The dialogue is just too clean. The narrative arc is too tidy. Real life, especially terrifying real life, rarely unfolds with that kind of structure. How was Kate having these full conversations, reciting these full scriptures? We just don't know. The Andrew Jackson story is also very suspect. There is no mention of the visit in Jackson's own personal letters or journals. For a man who documented his life extensively and who later became President of the United States, a night spent with a supernatural entity seems like the kind of thing you would write down. But he didn't. His companions didn't either. The story appears to have been added to the legend at some point after the fact, probably because attaching a famous name to a ghost story makes it more credible and more shareable. It's a very human thing to do, and a lot of the stories of the visits of the Bell Witch Cave now on YouTube or in movies or anywhere will allude to this Andrew Jackson story as if it was fact, but we just don't know. Now, the skeptical explanations, because we're going to play both sides here. One of the most discussed explanations centers on Betsy Bell. In many historical cases labeled as poltergeist activity, with unexplained sounds, movement, or physical disturbances, researchers have noticed a pattern involving individuals under periods of heightened stress, often during adolescence. Some investigators have proposed a theory known as recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis, or RSPK. The idea suggests that under certain conditions, a person might unconsciously produce physical effects in their environment. It's a controversial concept for sure, and not widely accepted, but it has been explored in attempts to explain cases like this without turning to the supernatural completely. If that framework is considered at all, Betsy becomes a central figure, not because of who she is, but because of the intensity of what she was reportedly experiencing at the time. Then there are the darker theories. Some researchers, and the 2005 film leaned into this, suggest that the haunting was either a cover story for abuse occurring in the household or a fictitious story that grew out of family dysfunction. John Bell's deteriorating health, Betsy's broken engagement, the specific targeting of a patriarch. Some read a very human story of a family in crisis hiding behind the supernatural. It's also worth considering the social context. In early 19th century rural Tennessee, community identity was tightly woven. The Bell family's neighbors didn't just come to witness the haunting. They participated in it. They testified to its reality. They contributed to its growth in a community where the supernatural was a living, breathing part of daily religious and cultural life. It's not hard to see how a story could become real simply by just being believed. None of this is a definitive answer, and I think that's okay. The honest position is, something happened in that farmhouse. We don't know what. We have one heavily mediated account, published decades after the fact, filtered through multiple retellings and shaped by the cultural appetites of every era that touched it. What we can say with confidence is that the Bell family believed something was happening to them. Their fear was real, their grief over John Bell's death was real, and the community that gathered around them and gave shape to the experience, they were real too. Now, over the years, paranormal investigators have made the trip to Adams, Tennessee, hoping to document what the legends claim. And the Bell Witch has not made it easy for them. Ghost Adventures were the first TV paranormal team to investigate the Bell Witch Cave, and made sure you knew it, as Zach will voluntarily, at every opportunity, tell you so. Armed with EMF detectors, thermal imaging, spirit boxes, and static night vision cameras positioned throughout the cave and the old Bell property, the team descended on Adams for a full lockdown investigation. Inside the cave, a disembodied voice was captured, appearing to say, "Listen to me." The crew also documented balls of light moving through the cave with no identifiable source. EMF readings spiked in specific chambers and patterns Zach described as responsive rather than random. This episode is heavily criticized, like most paranormal television, but you can be the judge of that if you so choose. The episode is available on Hulu and is Ghost Adventures Season 13, Episode 1. YouTube has brought a new generation of investigators to Adams, Tennessee, and few visits have generated more discussion than the one by Sam and Colby. The pair arrived with Candy Wooten, director of operations at the Bell Witch Cave, and almost immediately, the location began to respond. A camera shut off without explanation during the investigation. Their DR60 EVP recorder captured audio that appeared to directly answer their questions, including what may have been the name Kate.
Kate? I think that's just a fucking Kate.
At the Bell Witch Memorial, they deployed an Ovulus, which is a yes or no device based on energy changes and fluctuations, along with an EMF detector. The EMF spiked repeatedly while the Ovulus spit out contradictory answers, a pattern some investigators read as an unstable or intentionally evasive presence. While Candy reported scratches appearing on her mother's face while staying in the Bell's home, show's co-host Sam himself walked away with a visible red mark running the length of his neck, with no clear explanation how it got there. But some of the most active accounts don't come from television crews or YouTube. They come from the people who work there. Staff at the Bell Witch Cave have described hearing voices inside the cave during off hours. Not echoes, not water sounds, but something that carries the cadence of speech. One longtime employee reported feeling physical pressure on their shoulders while alone in a back chamber, as if something was pushing down. A tour guide described a moment where a guest's camera just shut off completely at the entrance to the cave, powering down mid-sentence, and would not turn back on until the group exited. When they returned outside, it functioned properly. This could be attributed to the heavy limestone in the cave itself, much like what we saw with the Stanley Hotel and what it was built upon. Whatever is or isn't in that cave, people keep experiencing something they cannot explain, but they keep coming back. So why does this story refuse to die? Why are we still telling it? And why do we still not know the answers? 200 years. That's how long the Bell Witch has been haunting the American imagination. We've put men on the moon. We've mapped the human genome. We carry the sum of human knowledge in our pockets. And yet here we are, still talking about a voice in a farmhouse in Robertson County, Tennessee. I think there are a few reasons. The first is that the story is genuinely unresolved. We don't have a satisfying explanation. The haunting of the Bell family doesn't fit neatly into any box. Not the supernatural box, not the psychological or hoax box. The discomfort in not knowing keeps us engaged in this story. We're pattern-seeking creatures that hate open loops. The Bell Witch is a 200-year-old open loop. The second reason is that the story is deeply human. At its core, this story isn't about a ghost. It's a story about a family. A father who was targeted by something he couldn't fight. A mother who was inexplicably protected. A daughter whose life was disrupted. Whose engagement was destroyed. Who carried whatever happened to her for the rest of her life. Betsy Bell eventually married someone else, had children, and lived to old age. But she reportedly never spoke in detail about what happened on the farm. She took it with her. Was the abuse portrayed in the movie accurate or just an assumption? Or what about Kate Batts? What did John Bell do to her that was so vile that it made her return in the afterlife and literally kill him? The third reason is location. The American South has a particularly rich relationship with the past. The land there carries weight of history, of loss, of violence, of memory. Ghost stories in the South aren't just entertainment. They're a way of processing what the ground remembers. And finally, I think the Bell Witch endures the test of time because it forces a question that we haven't answered and maybe can't answer. What are the limits of the human mind? What happens when a community collectively believes in something? Does belief have physical force? Can fear or grief maybe even trauma, express itself in ways that look, from the outside, like the supernatural? These are not small questions. They are, in a very real sense, questions about the nature of reality. The Bell Witch doesn't answer them, but it insists that the questions be asked. I've done a lot of research for this episode. I've read Ingram's 1894 account. I've read the skeptical analysis. I've watched all of the paranormal investigations my stomach could handle. I've read about Betsy Bell's life after the haunting, about Adams, Tennessee today, about the people who live near that cave and go about their lives in the shadow of a 2-century-old legend. And here's what I keep coming back to. Whether or not anything supernatural happened on the Bell farm, something happened. People died and a community was shaken. Those are real things that don't require a ghost to be true. But here's the thing about ghost stories. The best ones are never really about ghosts. They're about the things we can't explain. The grief we can't name, the darkness that lives inside ordinary lives and families. The sense that the world is bigger and stranger and even more dangerous than we'd like it to be. The Bell Witch has survived for 2 centuries because it speaks to something in us that we don't quite have words for. A fear that whatever is out there, in the dark, in the woods, or in a cave, just might know our name. The Bell Witch Cave is still there, just outside Adams, Tennessee. The Red River still runs past the old property, and if you ever find yourself on that land at night, standing at the mouth of that cave, listening to the water and the wind, pay attention to what you hear. In the next episode, we journey to the quiet farmlands of Harrisville, Rhode Island, where a woman's name has been dragged through 2 centuries of accusation, distortion, and Hollywood horror. We'll explain the true story of Bathsheba Sherman and ask a difficult question. What happens when an ordinary life gets swallowed whole by a legend it never consented to? Hollywood made her a monster, but the history tells a different story. I'm Johnny Clash, and this is Paranormal Unsettled. In the quiet countryside of Rhode Island, tucked away in the town of Harrisville, stands a farmhouse that has become one of the most infamous locations in paranormal history. Known to most as the Conjuring House, its walls have long been tied to stories of a dark presence, unexplained torment, and the name that continues to echo through every retelling: Bathsheba Sherman. The legend claims she was a witch, a woman accused of sacrificing a child to the devil, cursed to haunt the land long after her death. A spirit said to torment the living, to mark her territory, and to make her presence known in ways that could not be ignored. For decades, the real story has been buried beneath dramatized retellings, most notably in the 2013 movie The Conjuring, where fact and fiction blur into something far more terrifying than the truth shows. But when we step away from the screen and back into reality, the story of Bathsheba begins to shift, revealing something far less defined and far more grounded in truth than legend would have you believe. I'm Johnny Clash, a dad, a gamer, a former pro wrestler, and a lifelong observer of the unexplained. I'm not here to convince or dismiss. I'm here to document, to listen, and to stay with questions that do not resolve neatly. This is Paranormal Unsettled. On 200 acres of land with rolling fields, old stone walls, a brook nearby, a beautiful farmhouse, both inside and out, sits still and peaceful, especially on a quiet morning with the sun shining and the birds chirping. But if you know the names and the alleged hauntings associated with it, none of that matters. Because when you know what happened inside that house, the fields and the stone walls all start to feel like something else. Like a frame around something darker. The farmhouse was known as the Old Arnold Estate, but most people know it as the house that inspired The Conjuring. And the name they remember most from that film? The name spoken in shadow? The name that hangs over every room like smoke, both literally and figuratively. The name said to belong to the woman who never really left. Bathsheba. Bathsheba Sherman was a real person. She was born in 1812 and died in 1885. She was a wife, a neighbor, a woman who lived in a small Rhode Island town, worked the land, raised a family, and died long before anyone thought to make her a monster. What happened to her name, and what happened to her memory after she died is in its own way as haunting as anything that happens in the movie. This episode is not about the haunted house. It's about the woman whose grave people now visit for the wrong reasons, whose name has become shorthand for evil, and who had no voice left to offer any kind of defense. I think the best way to truly explore Bathsheba's legend and legacy is to start with the hauntings tied to her name. Not the version brought to life in The Conjuring, a film that helped define modern horror, but took its share of liberties with their story. This case also brings us back to Ed Warren and Lorraine Warren, who had heavy influence in how this story was retold and became the launching point for their perspective to be told on the big screen. We will explore their role in full in a future episode dedicated entirely to the Perron family haunting, but for now, this is where it begins. In 1971, Roger and Carolyn Perron relocated with their 5 daughters, Andrea, Nancy, Christine, Cynthia, and April, to a farmhouse at 1677 Round Top Road in Harrisville, Rhode Island. They paid around $80,000 for this beautiful property that Carolyn instantly fell in love with. It took Roger a little bit longer to fall in love with this property, but it seemed like the kind of place that families dream about, with farmland, a brook, and a big great barn. They moved in during the winter, and according to the family, the strangeness began to overtake them just as quickly as the snow had. Objects began to move, especially the children's toys. The refrigerator wouldn't stay shut, along with the latch on the basement door. The youngest daughters reported being tucked in at night by a presence that wasn't any member of the family. Andrea, the eldest, would later describe the entity as a woman who smelled of rotting flesh and spoke with a voice that didn't sound human. Carolyn received the brunt of the hauntings, much like the movie implied. And while there were multiple entities in the home, it was said to be a darker one that tormented her specifically. One night, Carolyn was home alone, as Roger worked away from home for sometimes weeks at a time. Her bedroom lit up in flames, with fire bouncing from the dresser to the walls to the curtains, only to just stop with no trace of ash or fire ever existing. But the most disturbing and most notable encounter happened one evening after the couple went to the movies and finally had a date night to themselves. Carolyn was awoken by an odor of rotten flesh, only to see the body of a woman hovering over her bed, with the feeling of restraint and not being able to move. The figure became increasingly distorted the closer it got, with a beehive-like head described as a hornet's nest, a broken neck hanging at an angle, and features that feel absent or erased rather than human. It's portrayed as gray and mesh-like, almost cobwebbed in texture, with no clear hands or feet, only a floating, suffocating presence that closed in on Carolyn. Only way to end the horror was by her calling upon the Lord in prayer. Roger himself, while fully asleep, woke up to scratches down his back, so deep they caused him pain, only to fade quickly as the day went on, as if they were never there at all. Andrea Perron, the oldest daughter, along with her sisters, had nightmares where they witnessed it all happen at the same time Carolyn was experiencing this, all alone and awake from her bed. After this one and many other occurrences, Carolyn began researching the property. It was during this process that she and her friend Fran scoured the archives together, anywhere they could. They traveled to the village of Shupachek, digging through local history records, and it was there they first encountered the name Bathsheba Sherman, tied to the old burial and family records connected to the land, or so they say. Fran would later describe Bathsheba as the principal suspect in the family's torment. Their words for her, based on what they learned, were simple and severe. The Bad Witch. According to Carolyn, Bathsheba Sherman was believed to have lived in the farmhouse during the 1800s. She is described as a deeply troubled figure, accused of killing an infant, possibly her own, using a knitting needle by impaling its skull, sacrificing the child by a fireplace, only to be caught by her husband. She was reportedly brought to trial and ultimately acquitted due to the lack of evidence, though locals painted her as dangerous long before and after the case. But the worst name attached to her? The Devil Incarnate. Lorraine Warren later reinforced the association to the name during her involvement in the case, identifying Bathsheba Sherman as the dominant spirit tied to the property, based on her psychic intuition. What a coincidence. Despite these hauntings, and trust me, there are way more than the ones we are talking about today, the family stayed in that house for nearly 10 years. 10 long years. I want you to think about that for a moment. Not days, not months, 10 years. They were unable to sell, with too much equity already tied deeply into the property. Whatever was happening in that house, whatever they experienced, it did not drive them away quickly, though Carolyn wanted to leave. You can find the full retellings from Andrea Perron's perspective in her book trilogy, House of Darkness, House of Light. I highly recommend it.
Right back after a crucial break.
Now let's talk about how a Rhode Island farmhouse became one of the most recognizable haunted locations in the world, because you already know the answer if you followed along this season. Hollywood. In 2013, director James Wan released The Conjuring, starring Patrick Wilson and Vera Farmiga as Ed and Lorraine Warren, and featured the Perron family's story at its center. The film was a commercial and critical success almost immediately. It earned over $300 million on a budget of around $20 million. Audiences were terrified, with some even having to leave the theater. And suddenly, a haunting that had lived mostly only in paranormal circles and in Warren lectures and interviews was now a global phenomenon. The film depicted Bathsheba Sherman, played by Joseph Bishara, who also plays a lipstick-faced demon in the Insidious franchise, as the central supernatural villain. A full-throated demon. A witch who killed a child, cursed the land, and whose spirit drove families to the edge of madness for over a century. She was even tied to the infamous Marytown Esty, a real Salem witch trial victim who was executed in 1692. But that connection only exists in the film, attaching real history onto a false narrative to make it feel a little bit more grounded, a little bit more real life. But for the film, it worked. It gave the haunting a face and a motivation. But for Bathsheba Sherman, the actual woman buried in a Rhode Island cemetery, it became kind of a second death. And for what it's worth, Roger Perron himself, the patriarch of the family that lived through this all, has said on record,
It's about 5% correct, 95% wrong.
So let that sit with you. The Conjuring universe has grown since into one of the most profitable horror franchises in history, spanning multiple films and billions of dollars in global revenue. Bathsheba Sherman is woven into the fabric of that franchise as its foundational villain, a woman who most viewers know nothing about beyond what they see on a theater screen. Just think about this for a second. You tell someone you know about the Conjuring house. The first thing they're going to say, isn't that the one Matt Rife owns? So there's a big chance they don't even know who Bathsheba Sherman is. Now, Lorraine Warren served as a consultant on the film, as we mentioned in the Annabelle episode, and the film's version of events aligned closely with how the Warrens had characterized the case in the years following their involvement. They did what we have seen many times in Hollywood, which is embellish the story in their favor. Now, Andrea Perron has spoken at lengths about how the film both captured and distorted her family's experience. She has said that the spirit in her home was not purely evil, and that's well documented in her books, which is exactly why they are titled House of Darkness, House of Light. There was a lot of good here too. There were presences of different kinds in that house. A man who just stood in the corner and watched. A little girl who would play with the children's toys. The entity she associated with Bathsheba was darker and more threatening, yes, but the full story is far more layered than the film could even begin to show. Pop culture doesn't leave room for these layers. It leaves room for a version that sells tickets. This is Hollywood. This is what they do, and we don't think anything of it. We just accept it. Anything for a buck and notoriety. That notoriety is what the Warrens are accused of seeking all along. Was this portrayal, this franchise, this global fame, reinvigorated by this franchise, the end of their story they desired, the way they wanted it, after all? Now, since 2013 and the movie's release, it seems a blood trail was left behind, in ways that not only tarnished the name of Bathsheba, but others who had real-life ties to the home. One of the most disrespectful acts that followed is what became of Bathsheba's grave. She is buried in a small cemetery in Harrisville. Since the release of The Conjuring, that grave has become a destination. People will travel to find it. They photograph it, they leave offerings and conduct EVP sessions. But then there are people who take it too far. The grave was destroyed and defaced, kicked over and broken, only to eventually have to be replaced entirely after just not being there for quite a bit. But it doesn't stop there. Former owner of the home, Norma Sutcliffe, who lived in the home from 1987 to 2019, received threatening phone calls and had trespassers on her property, some even charging the property with a gas can, claiming to vanquish the demons and burn it down. Luckily, they were stopped. In desperation, she has publicly stated time and time again that the house was not haunted, a last-ditch effort to make it all stop, but it wasn't enough. She eventually sold in 2019 to Corey and Jen Heinzen, who you may know from a lot of the videos that are out there on the home. The rest of the home's history gets a little blurry, and hopefully by the time we release a full episode on the Perron family haunting, things get cleared up a bit, but for now, the house is in the process of a long legal battle for ownership. We'll just leave it at that. But to those wondering if Norma ever experienced anything paranormal in the house, here's an audio clip from Season 2, Episode 7 of Ghost Hunters in 2005, years before The Conjuring even came to fruition.
I believe that we have a bona fide haunted house. I find it amazing that TAPS was able to document actual motion and evidence on film.
I understand why Norma would campaign so hard for this house to not be haunted. Her Facebook page has public videos where trespassers were detained on her property after the movie was released. This is no way for someone to live, especially in a house that they claim to have loved so much. She has also publicly condemned the statements made by Andrea and the Perron family about the house, claiming the stories to be false. But she sat down with Andrea Perron during Andrea's book tour in the farmhouse, where she shared some of her experiences. That's available on YouTube, but here's a short clip.
But if you'd be kind enough to share a couple of the experiences that you've had over the years.
When we first moved in, little things would happen, and I think the first one I can really remember is the footstep incident that my daughter encountered. She said, oh, it was like I was in the other room and I could hear, I think she either said the door opened or sounded like a door movement, and that she heard footsteps, so she thought somebody was here.
Like I said, I don't blame Norma. She did everything she could to save her property, but ultimately, it was just not enough. Now, as for Bathsheba, the woman buried beneath that stone, if she was a woman who lived an ordinary life, a wife and a neighbor, and nothing more sinister than that, she has had her resting place turned into a horror tourism attraction. While the demonic entity from The Conjuring still scares people to this day, we have to look at who she really was and whether she had anything to do with this legendary property at all. Here is what the historical record actually tells us about Bathsheba Sherman. She was born Bathsheba Thayer, and I hope I never have to say that again, in 1812. She married Judson Sherman in 1844 at the age of 32, which in that era would have been considered a spinster's age, a detail that itself may have had her a subject of local gossip before anything else. She lived in the Harrisville area of Burrillville, Rhode Island, speculated on Collinstaff Road doing chores and the ordinary work of a housewife. The 1850 and 1880 United States federal census records list her. She had children. She lived a rural New England life. She died in 1885. Her death certificate and the Burrillville Gazette list the cause of death as sudden paralysis, which in today's era is commonly known as a stroke. Not suicide like the movie portrays, not a curse, a stroke. She was 72 years old. Now here's something interesting, and this comes from Norma Sutcliffe's Facebook itself. In November of 2013, she condemns the Conjuring movie, trying to justify who Bathsheba was, just like we're doing today. Now there is a photo of Bathsheba, or it's claimed to be, and her family on the farm. It's the one photo that has circulated from time and time again since the movie has come out. Now interestingly enough, Keith Johnson, who is one of the original investigators of the Parent family home, commented on Norma's post and wrote, "The above-mentioned photo of a family picnic at the Arnold estate was presumably taken circa 1880s. Bathsheba Sherman may or may not have been living at that time, but if living, she would have been elderly and quite infirm at the time, and no one in the photo meets that description. Certainly not the young woman wearing a breathing mask. To my knowledge, there is no existing likeness of Bathsheba Thayer Sherman from life." Now, despite the speculation about this picture and it being Bathsheba, she still is documented. She existed. She was a real person. We can see her grave. However, there were several deaths connected to both the property and the Arnold family that were not her. Edie Arnold died of illness on the property on October 3rd, 1884. Abigail Arnold passed away on May 4th, 1884 at just 5 years old. A man named Jarvis Smith reportedly died in the barn after becoming intoxicated and just succumbing to the exposure of the elements. Other Arnold family tragedies occurred only near the home, including some in Tarkland and Uxbridge. But one of the most disturbing cases involved Prudence Arnold, who was murdered at the age of 11 by a farmhand after she refused his proposal of marriage. But again, that didn't happen on this property. Now here's a detail that deserves its own moment, because I think this is the gut punch. I think this is the most quietly powerful piece of evidence in Bathsheba's defense here. Burrillville kept a record, known informally as the Black Book of Burrillville, which chronicles the bad, the strange, and the tragic things that happen in that town. Murders, suicides, everything in between. The Arnold family appears in it. Others connected to the land appear in it. It was the kind of record that captured anyone who died in a peculiar way or whose life intersected with scandal or darkness. But guess who does not appear in this book? Bathsheba. Not even once. If she had been tried for killing an infant, if she had died under suspicious or violent circumstances, if the community had genuinely believed she was in league with the devil, something would have made it into that record, but her name is simply not there. What the record does not contain is any verified accusation of witchcraft. No documented charge, no court record, no coroner's findings, no newspaper account of an infant's death connected to her name. And researchers have been unable to find any court document supporting the accusation at all. The story of a sewing needle, the sacrifice, the curse, none of it appears anywhere in historical documentation. A trial involving a woman accused of plunging a needle into an infant's skull would have been front-page news in a small Rhode Island town. There is no such record. But what about her children? The legend claims they all died in infancy, which was used to reinforce the idea of a curse or a pattern of death. But the census tells us a different story. Bathsheba had children, Julia, Edward, Herbert, and George. And while the fates of some remain unclear, and 2 of them may have actually died in infancy, common at the time as medicine and science weren't the clearest. Her son Herbert Sherman lived a full life as a farmer, had a family of his own, and outlived his mother. The image of Bathsheba as a woman surrounded by infant death is unfair and just frankly unjust. And here is perhaps the detail that cuts most directly against the witchcraft narrative. Bathsheba Sherman was a lifelong member of her local Baptist church. Her minister, the same man who knew her in life, who knew her community, oversaw her funeral. Both of those things become essentially impossible to reconcile with a woman who is openly known to be in league with Satan. And here's the detail that tends to get buried most of all. Bathsheba Sherman did not live in the Arnold estate. She lived on her own farm miles away. The Arnold family appears in the records connected to that property. Bathsheba does not. What we have then is a woman whose name happened to be connected to the land through local history and family records. Records Carolyn Perrin and her friend came across during their research. And a framework the Warrens, remember, from Lorraine's intuition, then used to identify her as a present dominance. A name seized upon and assigned a darkness she may never have carried in life. What we have instead are layers of retelling. A family who experienced something frightening in their farmhouse. Investigators who interpreted that activity through demonic framework and gave that presence a name. And a film franchise that crystallized all of it into something permanent and global. It's worth noting that in small communities in 1800s, women who stood out for any reason, their appearance, their behavior, their independence, the age they were married, were all often subject to gossip and suspicion, much like we explored in the previous episode with Maud Dyer. It is entirely plausible that Bathsheba Sherman earned a reputation not because of anything she did, but simply because of how people chose to see her. A 32-year-old unmarried woman in 1844 Rhode Island was already an outcast, and sometimes that's all it takes. What is harder to reconcile is what actually happened in the Perrin house, because something did. And the person closest to that experience, Andrea Perrin, is not convinced it was Bathsheba at all, though her books do tell the tales of her mother. Andrea believes the darker entity could have been the former owner's wife, Susan Arnold, a woman who hanged herself in the barn in 1797. Not a witch, not a curse, a woman with her own tragic history. Whatever was in that house was disturbing enough that a family stayed through it for a decade and still carries it with them to this day. But whether that something was a spirit of a 19th century woman named Bathsheba Sherman, a woman the historical records suggest may have been entirely ordinary, is a question that cannot be answered with certainty in either direction, and one we may never know.
We'll be right back after this commercial break.
The Perrin family's 10 years in the old Arnold estate generated a body of testimony that has been examined, debated, and dissected in the paranormal community for decades since. Andrea's 3-volume memoir remains one of the most detailed first-hand accounts of extended paranormal activity in modern history. And again, this was published 2 years before the movie came out, and I believe she was writing it for 3 years prior. She describes not one presence but many. She describes the house as layered with energy, some benign, some threatening. She describes her mother's deterioration as the entity that called itself, or was called, Bathsheba gained more influence. She describes waking up and knowing the room had changed. She gives the texture of a childhood lived inside something inexplicable. And not to mention the story within this trilogy of books is way scarier than anything the movie has ever portrayed. Now, the Warrens conducted sessions at the property. EVP recordings were made. Their involvement, as with most of their cases, is both the most significant source of documentation and the most contested part of it. So much so that during a seance, they arrived with an entourage unexpectedly, which resulted in Roger Perrin doing what many people have always wanted to do, and punched Ed Warren in the face and yelled at him to get out after Carolyn's body was contorted, her chair levitated, her body flung across the room, knocked out cold. But there is one piece of evidence tied directly to Bathsheba that I want to share. While Andrea was at Bathsheba's grave, she captured an EVP that was discovered later unbeknownst to her. And what was on it was her name. Bathsheba screamed, not whispered, screamed, in front of 30 people who didn't hear it.
From the unsavory males that would come around.
Whether that is the voice of the woman herself, the residue of something attached to the grave, or something else entirely, is not something I can tell you, but it did happen. There has also been a television special, a 2-part series called Bathsheba: Search for Evil on Haunt TV, which investigated the story separately from the Perrin haunting narrative. During filming, a door was captured on camera closing, along with some energy in a window. Nothing conclusive, but nothing dismissible either. And in the years since the property gained fame from the movie, it has turned into somewhat of a paranormal hotspot and sought-after attraction. And of course, riddled with controversy. Just look it up. YouTube is full of investigations from Sam and Colby, Overnight, and just about every other major channel, as well as TV specials from Ghost Adventures, Ghost Brothers, and the early 2005 Ghost Hunters episode. And most of them, but not all, involve Andrea Perrin in some way. The house still stands, the land still carries whatever it carries, but investigators, previous owners, and visitors continue to report experiences, whether they want to still admit it or not. I won't dive into all of that today, since this episode is about Bathsheba and not the Perrins, even though I tend to get a little excited and I could just ramble on about this subject. But spoiler alert, come back in October. Now here are a few notes, some strange things tied to Bathsheba, whether coincidence or not. The Perrin family had a dog who unfortunately was struck by a car and died before moving to the Arnold estate. That dog was named Bathsheba. A name most of you may have heard for the first time today was the name of an entity and a dog tied to the same person. Carolyn claims to have named the dog randomly, just as Lorraine pulled the name out of thin air. That's just odd. Now here is an even stranger one, and maybe the most creepy. Norma Sutcliffe operated a daycare in the house for almost 20 years after the Perrin family left. The same house where the children were tormented prior. On an old chest, now stored in the basement next to the well, is the drawing of a crooked neck woman done by one of the children in the daycare. A child who had no knowledge of the legends, no exposure to the film or the books. No reason to draw what they did. The name Bathsheba is everywhere online in a way it simply wasn't before 2013. Search it now and you'll find the grave, the film stills, the YouTube investigations, the TikTok walkthroughs of the property, the reaction videos to The Conjuring, and buried somewhere in all of that, maybe a census record, maybe a genealogy entry, maybe something approaching the actual historical person. But at first glance, you get a demon. And hey, even I have a virtual walkthrough on my YouTube. Go check it out at Johnny Clash XP. But what gets amplified through all this? It's the myth. The witch, the needle, the curse. Those elements travel faster and stick harder than the more complicated, more human version of events. And so Bathsheba Sherman, the real woman, the documented Rhode Island resident, continues to recede further behind the version of her that plays well on a screen. There is something worth naming in the fact that a woman who becomes legend in paranormal history almost always carry accusations they could never answer. Bathsheba could not defend herself against the neighbors who whispered. She could not speak when the Warrens gave her name to a presence. She could not object when a screenwriter made her the villain of a global franchise, holding Annabelle in that rocking chair. She has been defined entirely by the interpretations of other people in every era of her legacy. Whether or not she was anything more than an ordinary woman who farmed Rhode Island land, attended her Baptist church every week, and died of a stroke in the Gilded Age, she deserved the chance to be remembered as a person rather than a symbol. She didn't get that chance. The story of Bathsheba is in many ways the fullest expression of what this season was about and what inspired it. She may have been a complicated person. She may have been entirely unremarkable. She may have been someone her neighbors loved or feared or simply didn't think about that much. We will never know. What we know is she was real, and somewhere in the distance between who she actually was and what her name now represents, something important was lost. If there is any kind of presence still attached to that land in Harrisville, if any part of what the Perron family experienced and what investigators continue to document reflects something genuine, then maybe the most honest thing we can do is hold both possibilities at once. That something happened there, and whatever it was not necessarily Bathsheba Sherman's fault. If she is at peace somewhere, I hope she knows her name is being said with more care than it often has been, because she was a person before she was a legend, and that feels much more worth remembering. And I hope one day to visit the old Arnold estate when it reopens and see what's there for myself. In the next episode, a special bonus, we step into Fall River, Massachusetts, where a crime scene, an axe, and a question that was never truly answered have haunted a family name for over 100 years. We'll explore the life of Lizzie Borden, the woman, the trial, the legend, and ask whether the story history handed down is the one she actually lived. I'm Johnny Clash, and this is Paranormal Unsettled. In a hot Massachusetts summer, in the mill city of Fall River, a house sat quiet on 2nd Street. Inside it, 2 people were dead, murdered in a way that left almost no one in the neighborhood or the country without an opinion. The man was found on the sitting room couch, his face reduced to something barely recognizable. The woman was discovered upstairs, face down on the floor of a guest room, having met a nearly identical fate. The accused was a Sunday school teacher, a woman who, by every Victorian measure, was not supposed to be capable of something like this. Her name was Lizzie Borden. And more than 130 years later, we are still not sure what she did or didn't do on the morning of August 4th, 1892. I'm Johnny Clash, a dad, a gamer, a former pro wrestler, and a lifelong observer of the unexplained. I'm not here to convince or dismiss. I'm here to document, to listen, and to stay with questions that do not resolve neatly. This is Paranormal Unsettled. Fall River, Massachusetts in 1892 was a mill city built on hope, smoke, ambition, and the kind of working class grit that built New England from the ground up. Most people in that town were stitching their lives together one shift at a time. And then there was 92 2nd Street. Andrew Borden sat a few rungs above all that. He made his money in furniture and caskets. 2 things that, if you think about it long enough, turned out to be ironic in the worst possible way. He had a wife, Abby, 2 daughters from his first marriage, a house that reflected how far he'd come, even if it didn't exactly reflect generosity. Andrew was not known for generosity. On paper, he was respectable, conventional, quiet. And then one August morning, that house became the most talked about crime scene in the country. Lizzie Borden. You know the name, most of you know the rhyme, most of you know the general vibe. An axe, murder, acquittal. But I bet most of you don't know actually what happened. What the evidence showed, what the trial revealed, what the press buried, and what the culture decided to remember instead. Because when you actually sit with those details, really sit with them, this stops being a nursery rhyme and starts being something far more uncomfortable. This episode is not a ghost story. It's about a woman who may or may not have killed her father and stepmother, who was tried in front of the entire country, acquitted, and then quietly outlived nearly everyone who had an opinion about her, and whose case to this day has never officially been solved. Most people know the name and skip past the person. Let's fix that. Lisbeth Andrew Borden was born on July 19, 1860 in Fall River, Massachusetts. Her mother, Sarah Anthony Borden, died when Lizzie was just 2 years old. Her older sister Emma was 12. On her deathbed, Emma's mother made her promise to look after baby Lizzie. Emma devoted much of her life to keeping that promise. 3 years after Sarah died, Andrew married Abby Durfee Gray. Lizzie grew up calling her Mrs. Borden, not mom, not mother, Mrs. Borden. She believed and said openly that Abby had married her father for his money. Whether that was true or not, it set the tone for the next 30 years inside that house. Lizzie attended public school in Fall River. She was smart, engaged, a real interest in literature and the arts. She was certainly not a wallflower. She frequently attended the Central Congregational Church, taught Sunday school, and deeply involved herself in community life, like the Christian Endeavor Society and the Women's Christian Temperance Union. In every organization she joined, Lizzie generally held a leadership role, the treasurer, the secretary. Because of her father's wealth and her standing in the community, they trusted her. And yet, despite all of that, Lizzie remained unmarried. Andrew Borden controlled a lot about his daughters' lives, what they spent, who they saw, how they lived, just about every measure. The men who would have her, her father viewed as fortune hunters and chased off. How ironic. Lizzie and Emma both lived in their father's house well into adulthood with no real path to independence unless Andrew provided it. And Andrew did not provide things easily. The Borden name was influential in Fall River. Andrew owned numerous properties, served as a bank president, sat on the board of directors of 3 other banks, and directed several businesses. At the time of his death, his estate was valued at $300,000, the equivalent of nearly $11 million today. Lizzie and Emma stood to inherit all of it. But Andrew didn't spend it. Despite his wealth, he was famously frugal. He refused indoor plumbing in a neighborhood where it was available and expected. A millionaire living like it was still 1850. The tension that created inside that house, between what the Borden daughters felt they were owed by their position and what their father was willing to give them, had been building for years. In the months before the murders, it came to a head. Andrew had been gifting real estate to branches of Abby's family, most notably a house to Abby's sister. Lizzie and Emma pushed back hard. They demanded a rental property that had once been their mother's home. Andrew sold it to them for $1, and then, just a few weeks before the murders, they sold it back to him for $5,000. That is a family argument with a dollar amount attached to it, and it happened weeks before 2 members of that family turned up dead. In July, an argument prompted both sisters to take extended vacations. They returned a week before the murders, and Lizzie notably chose to stay in a local rooming house for 4 extra days before going back home. She didn't want to go back home. And 1 week after she finally did, that's when the murders happened. This is the woman the world put on trial, not a monster. A 32-year-old Sunday school teacher who taught children and sat on charity committees. She hadn't called her stepmother a mother in years. That is exactly who was sitting in that courtroom in 1893, and that is exactly why the Victorian imagination couldn't process what came next. August 4th, 1892, a Thursday. The temperature climbed into the 19s. Brutal, suffocating heat, the kind that makes a New England summer feel like a punishment. Andrew left around 9 o'clock to handle business downtown. Abby had been seen making the beds in the upstairs guest room. The household maid, Bridget Sullivan, who the family called Maggie, a carryover habit from a previous maid, had been outside washing windows. John Morse, Andrew's brother-in-law from his first marriage, had spent the night and left before 10. Emma was 15 miles away in Fairhaven visiting friends. Lizzie, the 32-year-old, was home. Sometime between 9 and 9:30, Abby Borden was struck 18 to 19 times in that upstairs guest room, found face down on the floor between the bed and the dresser. By the time the investigators examined her, the blood had already begun to congeal, meaning she had been dead for somewhat between 60 and 90 minutes before anyone discovered her. That detail matters. Hold on to it for a second. Andrew returned home around 10:45. Bridget went to let him in through the front door, and here's the detail I keep coming back to. The lock was stuck. It was giving him trouble, which Bridget noted as unusual. She was fumbling with it, trying to get it open, and from upstairs, from the floor where Abby Borden's body was already cooling on the other side of the wall, Bridget said she heard laughter. Lizzie's laughter. Whether that means anything, I'll let you decide. But if you were in that house and you knew what was up there, that's a strange sound to be making. Now, Andrew eventually came inside. He was tired. He had been out all day in that 90-degree heat, and by most accounts, he wasn't feeling well. The whole household had been sick that week, vomiting and unwell, blamed on bad mutton being served and then reserved in the summer heat. He went to the sitting room and laid down on the sofa. Didn't change his clothes, didn't take off his shoes. Just a man who came home exhausted and wanting to rest for a while. A little strange he didn't take off those shoes. But sometime around 11:15, he was struck 10 to 11 times in the face and head while he slept. He was found there, still on that couch, one eye split by the weapon, his face barely intact. And that couch still exists. It still sits in that house today. Sure, it's been reupholstered, but you can stand in that room and look at that exact piece of furniture Andrew Borden was lying on when he was killed. That detail just hits every single time. Bridget heard Lizzie from the bottom of the stairs, yelling, "Come down quick. Father's dead. Someone came in and killed him." But her story shifted more than once. She told police she had been in the barn loft looking for lead sinkers for a fishing trip. She heard a noise, came in and found him. She said she hadn't been upstairs, hadn't seen Abby since that morning. So when asked where Abby was, Lizzie suggested she may have received a note and gone to visit a sick friend. No note was ever found. No sick friend ever came forward. But when the police officers reached the house, Andrew was still bleeding. Abby, upstairs, was not. The blood around Abby had coagulated, dark and sticky, meaning her murder had happened considerably earlier. 2 deaths in the same house. 2 very different states of blood. Most of the officers who interviewed Lizzie reported that they disliked her attitude. Some said she was too calm, too poised, not crying or shaking. Composed in a way that read to the men questioning her as suspicious rather than a strong individual. Despite her behavior and her changing alibis, she was not checked for bloodstains. They did search her room, but at trial, they admitted they hadn't done a proper search because Lizzie said she wasn't feeling well. And they were criticized for their lack of diligence on this case. A double murder, the prime suspect on the premise, and the police didn't check her for blood because she said she didn't feel well. When asked about Abby, Lizzie suggested she had gone to visit a sick friend and might have returned by now, and asked if someone could go upstairs and check on her. Bridget and a neighbor named Adelaide Churchill went up together. They were halfway up the stairs, their eyes level with the floor, when they looked through the doorway and saw Abby lying face down. And in their search of the basement, the police found 2 hatchets, 2 axes, and a hatchet head with a broken handle. The break appeared fresh. The ash and dust on the head appeared to have been deliberately applied to make it look undisturbed. Yet none of those tools were removed from the house that day. They left them there. Now here's a detail that bothers me, and I don't know why it does. The autopsies were conducted in the dining room of the Borden house. That just doesn't sit right with me. On August 8th, Lizzie appeared at the inquest. The court refused her request to have her attorney present, citing a state statute that inquests must be held in private. She answered questions without a lawyer. Her testimony, the most revealing, the most contradictory, the clearest window into what she knew and when, was later ruled inadmissible at the trial. The public never heard it. The jury never heard it. On August 11th, 1 week after the murders, Lizzie Borden was arrested.
Right back after a crucial break.
The trial of Lizzie Borden opened on June 5th, 1893 in New Bedford, not Fall River, which tells you something right there. The city where it all happened was considered too inflamed, too opinionated, too far gone to produce an impartial jury. Fall River was excluded from the jury pool entirely, tilting selection towards the county's small agricultural towns. Half the jurors were farmers. The rest were tradesmen and small business owners. Most were practicing Protestants, some with daughters around Lizzie's age. 3 judges presided. The prosecution was led by Hosea Knowlton and William Moody. Moody would later become a United States Supreme Court justice. The defense was led by Andrew Jennings and former Massachusetts Governor George Robinson. That last detail matters more than it sounds. Robinson, as a former governor, had appointed one of the 3 sitting judges presiding over the case. The fix wasn't in, but the deck wasn't exactly level either. Before a single piece of evidence was shown to the jury, the prosecution made one of the most dramatic choices in American courtroom history. Both victims' skulls had been removed during the autopsy and were admitted as evidence presented on the first day of trial. Upon seeing them, Lizzie fainted. Whether that was grief, shock, or performance, nobody could say for certain. But it played. And then it backfired because a woman fainting at the sight of her parents' skulls did not read as guilt in 1893. It read as exactly what the defense needed it to read as. The prosecution's most damaging evidence never made it to the jury at all. The prussic acid. Lizzie walked into the drugstore the day before the murders and attempted to buy a highly toxic poison, and it was ruled inadmissible. The judge determined it was too remote in time to have any connection. The inquest testimony, given without her lawyer present, was thrown out. What actually triggered the grand jury indictment was Alice Russell, a close family friend who had stayed with the sisters in the days after the murders. Russell told the grand jury she had witnessed Lizzie burning a blue dress in the kitchen stove on the morning of August 8th. Bridget Sullivan had already placed Lizzie in a blue dress on the morning of the murders. That combination was enough to indict, but it still wasn't enough to overcome what the prosecution was working with. The case rested largely on circumstantial evidence and the argument that no one else could have done it. Prosecutor Moody appealed to what he called the cleverness and slyness of women, a strategy that, sitting here in 2026, is remarkable to see in a court record. He was essentially arguing that she was smart enough to pull it off. The defense countered with everything the culture provided. Lizzie's reputation, her church membership, her charitable work. She's not capable of such a fiendish deed. A Sunday school teacher? A committee member? Not someone who does this. Then came the judge's charge to the jury. And I think this is the moment that decided everything. Justice Dewey told jurors they should take into account Lizzie's exceptional Christian character, which tilted the court in her favor. The jury had already made up their minds. They waited an hour before coming back so it wouldn't appear they'd been hasty. When the foreman spoke, the verdict was 2 words: not guilty. Lizzie let out a yell, sank into her chair, put her face in her hands, and then let out a second cry of joy. Walking out of that courthouse, she told reporters she was the happiest woman in the world. The crowd outside cheered, and Lizzie Borden went home to Fall River, the only person ever tried for these murders, and the last.
Lizzie Borden took an axe and gave her mother 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, she gave her father 41.
So how does a double murder on a quiet street in Fall River become one of the most enduring criminal legends in American history? Same answer as always: the press. In 1892, American newspapers were deep in what historians call yellow journalism. Sensationalism, competition, and willingness to run with a great story, whether or not it was particularly careful. The Borden murders landed in the middle of all of that like a match in a dry field. Papers descended on Fall River. The image of Lizzie, composed, dressed in black, fanning herself in a packed courtroom, got reproduced in exhaustive details across the country. By the time the trial began, much of the nation had already decided, and the way Lizzie looked and carried herself mattered in ways that actual evidence didn't, because the cultural story had already been written. The acquittal was met with cheering, and then came the rhyme. Lizzie Borden took an axe, gave her mother 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, she gave her father 41. With an unknown author, it circulated almost immediately. Wrong in almost every particular. Not an axe, not her mother, and certainly not 40 whacks. It turned this story into something children recited for decades. That's the whole story of the rhyme. It's catchy, it's wrong, but it was permanent. But the rhyme was just the beginning. It took a while, but Hollywood found Lizzie in the same way Hollywood finds everything, and eventually with its own agenda. In 2014, Lifetime aired Lizzie Borden Took an Axe, starring Christina Ricci in the title role. It was cold, calculating, compelling television, but with a questionable history. It had massive ratings. Lifetime liked those numbers so much they spun it into a full series. The Lizzie Borden Chronicles in 2015, still with Christina Ricci, which basically turned Lizzie into a serial killer, dispatching new victims episode after episode. Thoroughly entertaining, almost entirely fiction, and the line between the two was never made particularly clear. Then in 2018 came Lizzie, a feature film with Chloe Sevigny and Kristen Stewart as Bridget Sullivan, which leaned into the theory of a romantic relationship between the two women as context and possible motive. It was the most thoughtful of the productions. It was also still a dramatized interpretation of one theory among many, but not the answer. Every dramatization picks a lane. None of them have the option of saying we genuinely don't know, because that doesn't sell tickets or keep people watching past the first commercial break. I know this feeling. We just did Bathsheba. It's a habit of history and a habit of Hollywood. I also noticed in my research the lack of full-length documentaries that treat Lizzie as a person first. Most of what's out there pairs the case with ghost investigation of the house. And some of them feel campy in ways that do a disservice to the story that is genuinely complicated. We'll get to those investigations in a bit, but Lizzie Borden deserves to have her story told in its entirety without the EMFs and spirit boxes. Now let's set the record straight, as straight as a 130-year unanswered question will allow. The timeline is the first thing to understand clearly. Abby almost certainly died first, somewhere between 9 and 9:30, while Bridget was outside and Lizzie was somewhere in the house. The state of the blood, the pooling, the condition of the wounds was inconsistent with a recent death by the time the investigators arrived. Potentially 60 to 90 minutes between the two murders. 2 killings, same house, an hour apart. People moving around that space the whole time with no alarms raised. If someone from outside committed both murders, they would have had to enter the house, kill Abby, hide somewhere inside that relatively small home for over an hour, wait for Andrew to return, kill him, and leave, without being seen by Lizzie or Bridget, and without leaving the blood in the common areas on a 90-degree Thursday morning. That is not impossible. It is, however, a remarkable series of things to pull off invisibly in broad daylight. No definitive murder weapon was ever proven. A hatchet head that was found in the basement, handle freshly broken off, the head coated in ash as though deliberately disguised. No blood or tissue was ever confirmed on it. Lizzie showed no visible blood when the officers arrived, which the defense used as proof of innocence, and prosecutors countered by noting she had time between the two murders to change or dispose of clothing. Speaking of, then there's the dress. Several days after the murders, Lizzie was observed burning a dress in the kitchen stove. She said it was stained with brown paint, but when the neighbor witnessed it and told the investigators, that image, a woman feeding clothes to a fire days after a double murder, that stays with people. And then there's the poison. The day before the murders, Lizzie attempted to purchase prussic acid from the local pharmacy, a highly toxic substance. They refused the sale, but in the days leading up to the murders, both Andrew and Abby had been sick, vomiting, unwell, blamed on the bad food. The failed poison purchase, the household illness, the murders, all of it was a thread investigators desperately wanted to pull, but the court never let them. The evidence, inadmissible. Now the theories, these are laid out honestly. The most compelling case is that Lizzie did it. She had motive, a strained relationship with her stepmother, resentment over estate planning, anxiety about inheritance. She had access. She had opportunity. No verifiable alibi a second witness could confirm. Her story shifted. No intruder was identified. No forced entry was found. With Andrew and Abby out of the way, Lizzie and Emma stood to inherit that large amount of money. Worse crimes have been committed for far less. Now, the unknown intruder theory kind of demands that you accept a chain of circumstances, but that gets harder to justify the more closely you look at it. And then there's the John Morse theory. I want to spend a real minute here because his name deserves more than a passing mention. We mentioned earlier that he was staying at the house. Morse was the brother of Andrew's first wife, Lizzie and Emma's biological mother. He had rarely met with the family after his sister died, but he showed up the night before the murders, arrived around 1:30 on August 3rd, and was invited by Andrew to stay and discuss business, specifically property transfers, in a household already simmering over exactly that subject. Here's where it gets interesting. John had been trained early in life as a butcher. I'll just leave that sitting there for a moment. A man trained in the precise, systematic work of cutting through flesh and bone, sleeping in a guest room the night before 2 people in that house were hacked to death. Chances are he didn't faint at the sight of a skull. On the morning of August 4th, it said he left the house around 8:45, walked to visit relatives who happened to be in town, confirmed an alibi at their address, and returned around noon, by which point both bodies had already been discovered. Law enforcement described his alibi as absurdly perfect and over-detailed. Not just accounted for, over-detailed. There is a difference between remembering where you were and recounting it with the kind of precision that makes investigators tilt their head. But when he returned to the Borden house that afternoon, the street was crawling with police and onlookers. And John Morse walked casually to the pear tree in the backyard and began eating a pear. The house where his brother-in-law and sister-in-law had just been killed, active with investigators. And he just stood under a pear tree and had a snack. On August 5th, he left the residence and was mobbed by hundreds of people. Police had to escort him back inside. Fall River didn't like the look of him either. There was even a rumor, which I cannot confirm, that he spent the night of the murders sleeping in the guest room, where Abby's blood still stained the floor. And now we're going to save this for next season, which we're going to announce shortly. But John Morse was also briefly a suspect in the Villisca axe murders. But now here's the honest version. His alibi was confirmed. The woman he visited confirmed exactly when he arrived and left. For him to have physically killed Abby, he would have had to run back to the house, commit the murder without Lizzie or Bridget noticing, and then get to his alibi location in record time without anyone seeing an elderly man running across a busy city. That's a very tight window, possibly too tight. But co-conspirator is a different question than sole perpetrator. Did John Morse know something? Did he give someone the window they needed and then make very, very sure he was visibly elsewhere? I can't tell you. Nobody can. Maybe the pairs can. But the truth is, the trained butcher was in the guest room the night before with an overly detailed alibi. That is a man who understood what law enforcement would be looking for and who made absolutely certain he couldn't be placed at the scene. Now, Bridget Sullivan has also been raised as an alternative, but she had no established motive and reasonably accounted for mourning. She moved away quietly after the trial, not back to Ireland as legend has it, but to Montana where she spent the rest of her life. And then there's Emma. Lizzie's older sister stood by her through the trial and for years after. Then in 1905, Emma packed her things, walked out of the house she shared with Lizzie, and never spoke to her again. No public explanation, no interview, no letter that's ever surfaced. Whatever Emma came to believe, she kept it for 22 years until she died on June 10th, 1927. Lizzie had died only 9 days earlier on June 1st. They are buried in the same cemetery, sisters who hadn't spoken in over 2 decades, buried together in the end. Acquittal does not equal innocence, but it also does not equal guilty, and that is exactly where this case has lived for over 100 years.
Right back after this commercial break.
Now, I'm not going to pretend I don't love this part every episode, but I do feel that Lizzie Borden house investigations are very oversaturated in the field. But as we have it, the house at 92 2nd Street still stands. It has operated as a bed and breakfast for years, trading on the notoriety of what happened inside. And whatever you want to say about how that history has been commercialized, and there's plenty to say, the reported activity in that house goes well beyond anything commercially motivated. Guests have reported the apparition of a woman in Victorian dress seen primarily in the upstairs guest room, where Abby Borden's body was discovered. This figure has been reported independently by visitors who had no prior knowledge of which room they were staying in or what happened there. She does not interact, she does not threaten, she simply appears, and then she doesn't. In the room where Andrew Borden was found on the couch, guests report an overwhelming sense of dread that hits them before they even know what they're standing near. Some feel suddenly nauseated. Some report difficulty breathing that clears the moment they step out. Whatever energy attaches itself to a space where a violent death occurred, that room seems to carry it. Visitors usually report experiences on the upper floors where they hear children laughing or feel like they're being touched by small hands. Many investigators bring toys specifically for this reason, which is strange because Lizzie never had children. The explanation that gets offered is that other families lived in that house before hers, and whatever remains there isn't all from August 4th, 1892. Now let's talk about the TV investigations because not all of them are created equal, and I think that's worth being honest about. Ghost Hunters, TAPS, investigated the Lizzie Borden house in Season 2, Episode 12 back in 2005. They were told about a cleaning lady who had quit after seeing an indentation of a body shape in the upstairs bed, and a tour guide who felt someone shove him from behind in Abby's room. One team member reported seeing a black mist in the room where Andrew was found. Donna and Andy heard unexplained noises from somewhere on the floor they were on but couldn't locate the source. Jason and Grant, being Jason and Grant, debunked the body indentation by pointing out that the mattress sagged over time regardless. Solid, responsible, and ultimately they found almost nothing conclusive.
I think any place that has a gift shop is probably not haunted.
They walked away with the odd noise and the unresolved feeling, which is honestly a more credible result than some shows have produced there since. Speaking of, my favorite, Ghost Adventures, went in for Season 5, Episode 5 in 2011. Zach, Nick, and Aaron locked down and things escalated quickly. Nick and Zach both reported being overwhelmed by what they described as an unknown aggression. We've seen Zach have that one before. The EVPs collected that night included some striking captures.
What was the name of the family that's had a lot of murders at this property? Borden. Can you tell me what your first name is? Abby. Did you hear that? Abby. Did you hear that?
Yeah, I did.
Can you tell me who attacks people here? Lizzie. Did you hear that? It goes Lizzie.
Make of those what you will. Zach Baggins makes everything feel like a spiritual emergency, so the context matters. But the volume of the apparent responses in a single session is worth noting. Then there's the shock doc. I put this on the other night on HBO, expecting a nice, uniform documentary in a pretty little package, just like the other ones they have done. But what I was met with was The Curse of Lizzie Borden, which aired in 2021 on the Travel Channel. Paranormal investigator Dave Schrader assembled a team of experts to investigate whether a dark family curse led to the murders, culminating in a seance to, and I'm quoting the episode description here, close the portal of evil forever. I'm going to be honest with you, the IMDb rating on this one is a 4.5. Reviewers describe it as a poorly acted seance with very little to do with Lizzie Borden as a person. One reviewer called it demon hunting and spirit writing dressed up as a documentary, and I don't entirely disagree. I'm not sure I even finished the entire episode. And buried inside the campiness, there is one piece of evidence from that episode I can't fully dismiss just as a listener, but I can play it and let you decide.
I was standing just outside this hallway, and I heard what I believe sounds a woman saying, "It wasn't me." And I said, "Did you do it? Who did it?"
Local paranormal investigator Luann Jolly captured an EVP in Lizzie's bedroom that reviewers described one of the clearest ones they have heard. When played forward, a woman's voice says, "I'm a good daughter."
And it's like she's calling out, like she's crying, "I'm a good daughter." Yeah.
When the same recording was played backwards, a second female voice says,
"My daughter was raped." I mean, I hear it dead on. That's exactly what's playing to us right now.
The speculation is that the second voice belongs to Sarah Borden, Lizzie's biological mother, who died when Lizzie was 2 years old. I don't know how to evaluate that. I don't think anyone does. The shock doc's packaging around that moment is ridiculous. The seance is very theatric, closing the portal of evil forever. It's the kind of framing that makes serious investigators want to pull their hair out. And then there's the detail that gets under my skin the way the best details always do. Multiple guests who knew nothing about Emma Borden, nothing about her estrangement, nothing about their 22 years of silence, have reported independently sensing two distinct presences in that house. Not hostile towards each other, but separate. Unresolved, as if whatever remains in that space reflects the same silence the two sisters kept in real life. Lizzie Borden and Emma moved out of 92 2nd Street after Lizzie's acquittal and purchased a Victorian mansion named Maplecroft at 306 French Street, only a few streets away from where the murder took place. How did they pay for a house like this? With maids and coachmen? Well, because Abby died before Andrew, her estate went to Andrew first, and then, when he died, it passed to his daughters. Interesting. Lizzie lived until 1927, 35 years after the trial. She died of pneumonia, a complication of having her gallbladder removed. She was only 66. She left a portion of her estate to an animal rescue organization. She requested a private funeral, planned it herself, leaving a list of those to be invited. When the guests arrived, they were told the funeral had already taken place the night before. She was buried next to the man many believe she killed. Maybe that means nothing. Maybe she had nothing to feel guilty about and loved her father despite everything. Maybe it means something more complicated, more human than any rhyme was ever going to hold. Andrew Borden was not a warm or generous man. He kept the house without modern plumbing. He managed his daughters in a way that a more charitable historian might call controlling. None of that makes murder an acceptable response, but it does complicate the portrait of a household where nothing was supposed to be wrong. The Victorian ideal said so, and yet. Lizzie chose to be buried in Oak Grove Cemetery in Fall River. Whatever she carried through 35 years of being watched by a city that had already decided who she was, she chose that proximity in the end. I have turned that detail over more times than I can count, and I still don't know what to do with it. Lizzie Borden was a real person who lived a real life inside a case that became a cultural shorthand for something the culture needed. A cautionary tale, a punchline, a Halloween costume. And somewhere inside all of that, a woman who sat in a courtroom for 13 days and was ultimately acquitted. Despite the hatchet, the missing note, the burned dress, the absent blood, the poison that never made it to trial, the laughter at the top of the stairs, the details that have outlasted everyone who is in that house, the investigator, the jurors, the neighbors, the journalists, and Lizzie herself, and they are still, after all this time, waiting for an answer that will probably never come. This season on Paranormal Unsettled, we stepped inside a glass holding a doll said to be possessed, wandered a mystery house filled with restless spirits, stood beside a witch and her rock, entered a cave where something once tore a family apart, returned to Harrisville where Hollywood reshaped a woman's name, and we closed with Lizzie Borden, a case where truth, legend, and judgment never quite aligned. Along the way, one thing became clear. These weren't just ghost stories. They were stories about women being labeled, dismissed, and rewritten in ways that still feel uncomfortably familiar today. And with that, this season comes to a close. A new season arrives at the end of June, diving into some of the most infamous haunted homes ever known. Until then, follow along, subscribe on YouTube, and remember, in the words of Carolyn Perrin, fear the living, not the dead. I'm Johnny Clash, and this is Paranormal Unsettled.
Paranormal Unsettled is written and produced by Johnny Clash. Want more unsettling content? Subscribe to Johnny Clash XP on YouTube and Paranormal Unsettled on TikTok. For gaming content, follow on Twitch and social media at Johnny FN Clash.